This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning and welcome to today's Environment Committee of the London Assembly. And I'd like to welcome everybody here today who are joining us either in the public gallery or online. And we've got two major items to discuss this morning. And the first of those is we are going to be talking to Thames Water about their long-standing, I think I can say, proposal for the SESRO, or South East Strategic Reservoir option. So we're going to be discussing why, where, how much, possibly, things like that. And following that, we're going to move on to the second topic of today's meeting, which is talking about heat networks, their potential for expansion across London to help meet heating needs of Londoners. However, before we get started, can I just remind you all to put your phones on silent, and if you leave them on vibrate, please don't put them immediately in front of the microphone, because the microphones will pick up the sound. And also, if you want to move the microphone, can I just remind you to pick up the microphone by its base and not by the neck, because the neck's break, and if you pull the gooseneck off, we might have to charge you for replacing it. And members of the public are encouraged to follow what we're doing on social media at London Assembly, and for this specific meeting, #Assembly Environment. Now, we've got a first few small items of business to get through on our agenda before we come to our two main items that I've just covered. And the first of these, I'm going to ask our committee clerk, Sal, if we have any apologies for today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. I think everyone else is all present and correct. Declaration... Oh, is he changing his name to Assemblymember Mountbatten Windsor, perhaps? Perhaps that's a terrible joke. The declaration of interests are found on pages 1 to 4. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out on item 2? That noted. Has anyone got any other interests that they need to declare today? No? OK, that's great. Item 3 is the summary list of actions to be found on pages 5 and 6. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from our previous meetings? Thank you. Which moves us straight on to item 4, which is talking about the South East Strategic Reservoir option. I think you've designed that to make it difficult to say, which is why everyone calls it SESRO. I'd like to welcome our guests from Thames Water to answer our questions. And we will be sticking to SESRO. We haven't invited you here to answer questions about the debt that Thames Water labours under, or any of the future of Thames Water questions that dominate the media. And we have managed to stick to that when we talked about the Teddington direct river abstraction, because the people that we've invited know a lot about SESRO and are not necessarily all over the detail of everything to do with rescue packages or renationalisation or anything else. So we will be sticking to SESRO. And we have two guests. We have Neville Muncaster, who is the Strategic Water Resources Director at Thames Water. You're very welcome. And we also have Rob Smith, who is the Specific Project Development Manager for SESRO at Thames Water. And we're going to start with a presentation from yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So, yes, my name is Neville Muncaster. I'm responsible for all our water resource strategy, which is our long-term planning, as well as the various schemes that we are bringing forward to improve resilience, particularly for London, which is what we're sort of here to talk to you about today. So I'll give a very brief overview, probably a bit more about weather than anything else, because I know you've heard about the need case before in terms of why we need a reservoir. But in short shift, that's because we are projecting 1 billion litres a day shortfall in water supplies in the net by 2050. Whilst 80% of that will be met by reducing demand, so reducing leakage and reducing customer demand, the final 20% is around new resources, of which SESRO will talk to you about in a second, is a key part. But it's critical for London, as you will be aware, that we don't run out of water, and sort of economic estimates in the past have been around a cost of £500 million a day to London if we get into shortfall and restrictions. So that is really what we're here to counter. we've got some slides, and if we just sort of talk through a couple, but I'll focus on the weather. And our main sort of drivers for why we need more water is around growth, population growth. We estimate around 2 million people will be coming to the region over the course of the next 25 years. On top of that, we have a changing climate you'll be familiar with, but we also have a need to improve the environment, and what that means is basically taking less water out of it. And if we take less water out of it, that means we need to find additional water resources from elsewhere, CESRO being a key piece. I really want to focus on this year's experience. I've been responsible for drought at Thames. I've been at Thames for 4 years now, and in that time I've seen 2 droughts. So the weather is changing, the climate's changing, and we're definitely seeing a greater impact. But there's a couple of graphs coming up. The first one there you'll see is really about our rainfall this year compared to average. And anything below the line in the orange means that we've had less than average rainfall. Anything else above the line shows that we've had greater than average. And you can see generally we've had below average rainfall. We've had about 57% average rainfall this year. And that means that the system does not have as much water in it as it usually does. And the way London is fed is from the Thames. Generally, water flows down the Thames from the West Country, and we take it out into our reservoirs that you'll be familiar with around sort of the west side of London, and use that to treat, and we provide water to Londoners from that. Without the rain feeding the Thames, we have very low flows. And I'll talk to you about groundwater in a second as well. And because we have low flows, then that means that we've seen a pattern where we have not been able to extract as much water from the Thames as we need to supply customers with, which means we start to draw down our reservoirs. And one thing to note in terms of resilience is that if you add up all the volume of London's reservoirs that exist today, if we don't have any water to fill them, you have about 100-day storage, which is not a great deal for a capital city of a country, and that's something that we think is really important as well, which is why we're pushing very hard for additional storage in the region. The next graph that you'll see, and you may not be able to make them out, but this is groundwater, starting on the left, which is our groundwater sort of right up in the west in the oolites and the limestone, which feed the Thames. And they're difficult to see on the screen you've got here, but if you look at the left, there's a black line you can see heading down into a red zone, and that generally shows the groundwater levels this year are much lower than they would normally expect them to be. And what that essentially means is if the groundwater is low in the west, there is nothing feeding the Thames. So again, we've had no rain, and because we have very little water in the groundwater, it means actually the Thames also has low base flows. All that contributes to the fact that we need additional storage. So what are we doing about it? We're going to talk to you now about CESRO as to why it is, and essentially it is a header tank for the South East. It's not just about Thames Water customers in London, it's also providing water supplies for Affinity Water and Southern Water. So about 15 million people benefit from this reservoir when it is built. I'm going to pass to Rob now, who's going to talk you through the scheme itself before we go to questions.
Thanks, Neville. Hi, I'm Robert Smith. I'm the project manager for CESRO from Thames Water. As Neville said, I'm just going to race through the scheme just to give you sort of the highlights of where the scheme is and where we've got to. So, as Neville said, the scheme itself feeds Thames Water customer, Affinity Water customers and Southern Water customers, so about 15 million in total. The reservoir, which is there in the centre, which will be based just outside Abingdon, is 150 million metres cubed, so a significant size, and the surface area itself is 6.7 kilometres. And to walk around the crest of it would actually be around 10 kilometres itself, so a very big reservoir. And it has the ability to provide up to 271 million litres per day, which would be split across the 3 bodies talked about. And this, just for comparison purposes, is equivalent to around 3 million baths. So moving on to the next slide, so how would the reservoir work? So this is a non-impounding reservoir, so it's not damming up a river. It's actually connected to the River Thames by a 3-kilometre tunnel, which we will build. So essentially, during high flow periods in the Thames, we'd abstract the water from the Thames, and we'd fill the reservoir and store water there until a time where there's need in the system to go back into the river when it's low. And we'd feed the water back into the river itself, and then it would be abstracted downstream like Neville pointed out, in the West London reservoirs, for example, and existing water treatment works facilities would do what they do today in terms of turning that into usable water. And as Neville mentioned, we're also feeding Southern Water customers a slightly different scheme there. So we're actually providing a water treatment works on site as part of our consent. And that will feed Southern Water customers through a new pipeline that will transfer water, clean water, down to Hampshire. That's part of a separate consenting scheme. Obviously, the key part of this is to provide water resilience. So we are building a reservoir, and that's the absolute key in terms of securing water for the future. But we recognise it's also a scheme that can provide a space for nature in terms of providing new habitats of grasslands, woodlands and wetlands, and also enhancing biodiversity in the local area. And also it should be a place for people, so something the community can be proud of. And we, as part of the scheme, we are planning on a water sports centre so people can use the reservoir itself. There'll be 2 further recreational lakes for smaller water sport activity, and there'll be 100 kilometres of nature trails, tracks, cycling facilities, etc. on the site itself. The master plan, I won't go into this in too much detail, but you can see on the right side of the screen, you've got the River Thames, and there's a 3-kilometre tunnel coming from the right side of the screen in front of you that feeds into the reservoir itself. The reservoir assets are the reservoir, but also the embankments that we're building to enclose the water. So the embankments will be between 15 metres and 25 metres high, and effectively provide that basin for the water to be stored. We've got the nature assets on site, as you can see, in terms of the green areas around. The area itself is around 6 Olympic parks in scale, just for comparison purposes. And we've got all the recreational facilities that go on top of that as well. In terms of building the reservoir, we're planning to submit the development consent order application later next year, so November 2026, and we plan to start construction, the main works construction, in 2028 or 2029. Prior to that, we plan to undertake some early works when the consent is in examination, and this will be the creation of habitats ready to relocate species as soon as the consent order is granted. We'll then go into an enabling works period, which is moving infrastructure, existing natural assets out of the way, so watercourses, utilities, roads, start building compounds for construction, etc. And we plan to do that by 2032, and then we'll start the main works of digging the borrow pit for the reservoir and building up the embankments. We've actually started on site, so over the last 2 years we've been doing a number of investigations, so ground investigations which have fed into the design process. We've done environmental surveys which have fed into early mitigation ideas, understanding the habitats that are there, understanding the water quality, etc., which have fed into the design process as well. And we've invested in a clay compaction trial, which is the big picture on the screen there, which was building a series of 3 test embankments, and that was really to see how the Kimmeridge clay in the area how it reacts during construction, and it's provided really positive results that we fed into the design process. And then finally, actually this, I guess, meeting today has come at a time which is a key milestone for the project, and that is we launched a statutory consultation for this scheme last week. So building on all the good engagement we've done to date within the communities and with technical stakeholders, we've launched an 11-week consultation which will comprise of 7 community events in the local area, as well as 2 webinars as well. And actually, we'd really like to hear from London and Londoners, because some of the benefits from the reservoir are for the people of London and Londoners. And we'll go on to the final image, which is a kind of hero image of the reservoir itself, and I'll just pass back to Neville just to conclude.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Rob. Well, I think really we've given you enough background. I'm happy to take any questions now that you have, Chair.
Thank you. Well, one of the reasons why we wanted to ask you to attend and go through the details was so that we could encourage Londoners to become involved with the consultation, which we knew you were going to be launching. As a cross-party committee, we may not be able to submit one response to the consultation ourselves, because we potentially may have different views from the different parties represented on the committee. You may find that the different political groups on the Assembly, which is Liberal Democrat, Green, Conservative, Labour and Reform UK, who are not currently represented on this committee, may send you comments individually, however, and we may, of course, encourage our constituents to respond as well. Having said that, I'm now going to open up for questions from my colleagues, and I'm going to start with Assembly Member Joanne McCartney.
Thank you. I've just been looking at a meeting I chaired in 2006, where you were explaining then about the need for the reservoir, not you personally. But, and can I ask, you're now going for such a consultation. What has changed so that you are now confident that this will be delivered?
I think a number of things happened. Firstly, we, as you're probably aware, every 5 years we do a water resource management plan which shows future need. The basis of that has changed in terms of the requirements looking much further ahead, and those requirements are set sort of by the Environment Agency and by DEFRA. So it means we've got an agreement now on the levels of risk that we need for the future, and on the back of that, CESRO is a preferred scheme under all scenario we've got going forward. And as a consequence of that, Secretary of State confirmed the scheme as, or confirmed the plan, I should say, which included the scheme in our water resource management plan for the first time last year. So we have confidence that the scheme will go ahead now because we've got government support for the scheme, and the statutory consultation, which sort of is part of the planning process, means that next year when we go into planning, the need has been defined and agreed, and it's really about the nature of the scheme itself that we'll be testing through the planning process.
And I think your timeline currently is for 2040 to have this up and running. Is that a realistic time scale, or is there any chance you might bring that forward?
So the programme itself is challenging, just because of everything we have to do in terms of the pre-works before we start major construction. So Rob talked about some of the sort of the ecology that we have to support. We have to translocate or move species out of the area. We've then got quite a lot of advanced works that we need to do as well, which means that we start construction proper early 2030s. So on that basis, it's a tight scheme, but we're currently working with government, with their new water delivery task force, to look at ways we can mitigate and bring forward the scheme to really ensure we hit that date of 2040 for water available.
I'm not sure you can answer this, but critics would say this scheme actually is just an excuse for Thames Water not to fix leakage, which is by far still a very big problem in London. What assurance can you give that that is not the case, and that those at work on leakages will not only be maintained but will be increased?
No, it's an important question for us to answer as well. And we go back to the basics of sort of the projections going forward. 80% of the demand or the supply gap is being dealt with by reducing demand, of which we are halving our leakage over the next 25 years. And that's a key commitment that we have to make to ensure that sort of everything balances. And then beyond that, even with customers using less water, which is what we are putting smart meters in the ground for, to help people understand their consumption and to help people manage water, we still need additional water supplies. So we've looked at a range of schemes. In all those, the reservoir comes out as a preferred selection.
Thank you. I have further questions, but I know others want to come in as well, so I might come back. Chair.
Okay, sure. I'm going to move on then, and I'll bear that in mind. And we'll start with Assembly Member Zach Polanski, if you'd like to come in next.
Thank you, Chair. I want to get on to asking you questions about the consultation, but just before that, there's some things that are out of the scope of the consultation, but they're the things that people most regularly contact us. Leakage, like we're just hearing, smart meters. How do we, as elected representatives, hold you to account if the things aren't included in the consultation?
So our commitments to leakage and metering, if you like, and managing demand are all part of the balance that we have in place. We're clearly regulated on those items through Ofwat, and we have very sort of defined targets that we need to meet every 5 years, and they are reset at that time with sort of the money allocated.
And so then the other mechanism is you have regular meetings with the mayor. In other countries, mayors are often on boards of Thames Water, or not Thames Water, of water companies. Would you welcome more kind of scrutiny or engagement with the mechanisms of politics?
I'm not sure I can answer that direct question, but what we do is obviously we do work very closely with the mayor. We listen, we attend as we need to the various committees to support, as we are doing today, to make sure that we are transparent in everything we do, and we welcome the interventions, whether it be on helping us with demand and managing, sort of working with customers on that, or also making sure that everything we do is visible and transparent to take the feedback.
Thank you. I note that the debt isn't in the scope of this conversation, and that's fine. This is privately funded, but this is unprecedented, something on this scale. But in some ways, it's a bit of a fiction that it's private funded, because this is going to come from bill payers ultimately. What return are your investors asking for? So we will take and use a model similar to the Tideway model, the Thames Tideway Tunnel model, whereby actually we will create, as part of this process, a new water company that will construct and then own this reservoir, so it won't be Thames Water doing that. And as part of that process, we will go to basically a tender process, a market process, to get the best rate possible in the markets. I can't tell you what that is now because we haven't been through that market process, but the intention is that we create a scheme which is the lowest possible risk, which means that actually we get the best possible finance cost. And what happens if Thames Water, say, went into special administration or it was sold?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, in fact. So actually, everything carries on. If we go into special administration or we have a change in ownership, then this scheme carries on. It's protected, the funding is ring-fenced, and it's a necessary requirement for the South East that the reservoir is built. So it would carry on as it currently is.
And any future owner would have to own the reservoir?
Yep, and there's a statutory obligation for the company to deliver the reservoir, and therefore it would have to be done, and funding is provided through customers to do that.
Thank you. You mentioned moving species. Could I ask about, will there be a biodiversity net gain?
Yes, do you want to pick that up, Rob?
Yeah, so we are going to meet the 10% biodiversity net gain, which is going to form part of NSIPs moving forward. So yes, there will be a biodiversity net gain as part of this scheme.
And is it just 10%?
That's what we're looking at as a minimum for the moment. We're still working through the complex calculations of what exactly the BNG benefit will be moving forwards.
And would you accept that, this will be quite disruptive and a huge project with cost pressures? Nature could simply just be engineered out of the way.
So we have a number of requirements to meet, which are written down in law, I guess, that we need to work through. And as part of the planning, you'll see that the changes we've made in the design from where it was a year ago to now has allowed more priority areas for that biodiversity.
Can I just come in as well? Just to remind that one of the key drivers of the scheme is the reduction in abstractions from the environment. So actually the scheme is an environmental project to reduce abstractions, to improve chalk streams, for instance, particularly for Southern Water, Affinity Water and ourselves, in the region. So on top of the BNG that Rob's talked about, there's also that underlying benefit that protects the environment from a water perspective.
Thank you. And finally, if that's okay, Chair. Yep. You're doing a consultation, except the statutory consultation. How else are you engaging with people who are critical of the scheme?
So we've got a team of experts out there who are engaging on a daily basis with the community themselves and with technical bodies. We're out there in the community. We've held formal engagement sessions previously. So we had a non-statutory consultation. We had events in the summer to provide updates. We deliver newsletters on a quarterly basis. We have dedicated email addresses. People can send in questions. So that community engagement is there on a daily basis.
I do have other questions, but I recognise the look in the chair that says stop, so I'm stopping.
Yes, please, because we've got 3 more Assembly members apart from yourself, and we do want to get on to the second topic that I mentioned. Can I just, picking up on the point about finance, the scheme that we're most familiar with and have spoken to Thames Water about many times is the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and that actually existing scheme that is almost complete, finished pretty much on time and pretty much on budget. It was done via a JV, a special financial vehicle, and it was in a joint venture, I believe. Is that the kind of mechanism that you're planning to use for this? And which would protect you in many ways from any issues to do with either Thames Water or its various parent companies beyond Thames Water. But is there any kind of scenario in which the scheme is not going to go ahead for whatever reason? Is there any kind of plan B? And obviously you'll gather I'm sort of caveating all of this around the financial situation. Is there any circumstances in which case it would not proceed? And what would you do if it didn't?
So answering the first question, yes, it's exactly the same model as Tideway. So special infrastructure project, basically, specified infrastructure project. It will be, we will go to market, we will bring in new investors, create a new company, which will then construct and manage and maintain the reservoir going forward. So that model's proven, and we're comfortable that it creates a robust scenario for the future. It's an extremist. If the scheme didn't go ahead, then it becomes tough for the South East, certainly. There are other schemes that we are looking at. None of them are currently in a deliverable state. So whether they be transfers from other systems, which we are continuing doing the design for, then we need to be sure that they will work. So those schemes in the background continue to move forward. Other opportunities become things like desalination or become reuse, which are schemes that we are also looking at. So we continue to work forward. At the end of the day, once the reservoir is built, if we need more water on top of that, we're going to need more schemes anyway, and that is what we're looking at now.
Yeah, I've gone through the Water Resource Management Plan process a couple of times, including long days of engagement down at the head office in Reading. So I think I'm familiar with all of those other alternatives, and some of them are fairly funky alternatives, I think we could say. They're kind of a bit out there. I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Thomas Turrell now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my questions, I just want to double check. Are you both aware of the London Climate Resilience Report that was published last year and its recommendations?
Yes.
Perfect. So in that report, one of the big recommendations that came out was that London does need another reservoir. Does this reservoir meet that requirement, or is it that this project has been going on so long that actually that report is saying that we need this reservoir and then another on top of it?
No, this is the reservoir that is referred to in that report, and this is what will give us that resilience to 2050.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. So then, looking at the existing reservoirs we have, we know that Thames Water have just completed their consultation around the works down at Mogden about taking the abstraction down there and pumping back. You mentioned something similar would be needed for this elsewhere in the river. Do you have any more information on where that would fall and what stations would be involved?
So alongside this, we have our Teddington scheme, which you refer to. That is ongoing. We'll go to Development Consent Order planning application next year as well. Beyond that, we're looking at other schemes, including a tunnel, which allows us to bring water back upstream from Surbiton into our West London reservoirs, making use of sort of the last drops of the river while protecting the environment. So that's a key scheme that we are currently looking at. And then beyond that, we have other schemes looking at either reuse or as a prime role from our works at Beckton to see if we can then use that water over, particularly in the east and the southeast of London.
Thank you very much. Our next person we move to is Assembly Member Gareth Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. Just for clarity on the consultation process that you're undertaking at the moment, is it just a Thames Water consultation, or are you also consulting with customers of Southern Water and Affinity Water? And are they separate processes if there is other consultations?
So anyone can respond to the consultation, I guess, is the answer to that question. But the events we're undertaking are very much within the local area for those impacted communities by the construction of the reservoir itself.
Okay. And because you mentioned you're going to be creating a new company which will be managing the reservoir and everything associated with it, how will any commitments which you arrived at as a result of consulting, you say, OK, we've consulted, this is what we're going to do, how can we be given an assurance that those commitments will be carried over to the next, to the new company? Because obviously they could wash their hands of it. So what commitments can you give us on that?
The whole intention of the DCO process is to make sure that those commitments become part of that planned approval, and we then have to follow those and deliver those, and whoever takes on the reservoir, those commitments get passed to.
Okay, there'll be a legal undertaking to do that. Okay. On the, we heard indirect reference to the TDRA, the Teddington Direct River Abstraction. It's not been the best consultation, if I may say so, and there's been a degree of public scepticism on it. Not least, one of the issues is that you've refused to release the number of objections, for example, and which has necessarily caused a degree of concern amongst those people who object to the scheme. Will you commit to a degree of more openness and transparency on this one, including publishing the number of objections, not just selective quotes?
So I'll take the question away. We have tried to be as transparent as we possibly can in terms of releasing the information that about the scheme itself and what is going on, and then responding to that and taking that forward into the DCO itself next year.
Okay, and just whilst I have the conscience mentioning the lack of detail on the objections on that particular scheme, can you give us an idea why you're refusing to, or why, but not you, Thames Water, is refusing to release the number of objections?
Are we talking about TDRA now?
Well, it is, but it's tangential. What I want to ensure is that this doesn't happen again.
But I do feel that's a bit unfair to put that to Neville and Rob particularly.
They may not feel it's unfair, Chair, if they have an objection.
Do you know why that the TDRA objection numbers has not been released?
I haven't got a direct answer to that question, no. But
could we get a written answer, please? Thank you. No further, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Roberts. I'm now going to move to our final questions from Assembly Member Bassam Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much. I think you'll see probably universal support for setting up this separate company, a separate entity, in order to deliver this project. We've talked about the risks of when that company is set up, so very much de-risking the delivery of this project, and we've seen, obviously on project, on time and on budget in terms of Thames Tideway, so very welcome. There is, of course, a risk ahead of it being set up in terms of being able to get it up and running, whether from a financial point of view, all sorts of other risk. How have you identified that in your risk matrix at the moment, and is it around deliverability or in terms of cost, or both?
Well, obviously we assess all those pieces, and the first point, sort of in terms of financing this development stage, we have ring-fence funding from the regulator, which is set outside just for this project, and we are working very closely with both our regulator and government, in fact, as well, to look at all the risks that we see over the next 4 years and beyond that, actually, and how together we can make sure that we unpick those. So we're being transparent on the risk process, whether it be in sort of the development stage or the early delivery stage or delivery itself, and then working to what are the options around that to ensure this scheme comes through.
So at the moment, how would you measure that risk at the moment? What are you saying on your risk register?
Specifically in terms of what?
Deliverability of this separate entity?
Well, we're comfortable that it's deliverable. What we're looking at then is how can we get the best timing out of this in terms of as soon as we can, in terms of that, we've got a 2040 date for water available for use. And then obviously we're looking at cost as well to ensure that we manage costs within the envelope we've put forward.
And there's no external challenges at the moment, given from a financing point of view, in terms of making sure that we get this across the line?
Not at the moment, no. We're still working very hard with the funding we've got, but also then the market will provide the funding for the reservoir itself.
And in terms of from bill payers themselves across Thames Water, Affinity Water areas, how are they going to see that impacting on their bills?
So obviously, well, firstly, we're looking to minimise the cost to customers for the outcomes that we're putting forward. But secondly, we've, I think, notionally said around £5 a month is the cost of this reservoir to customers by 2040. So that's not going to come in immediately because we don't start charging customers until we start construction.
So by 2040, about £60 a year on top of their bills?
That's what we're currently projecting, yes.
And go back to the environmental points that were raised before. What would be the cost, both financial or to the environment, of not delivering on this project?
Gosh, Well, I suppose the key thing is this is about resilience for the region, not just London, and that without the reservoir we'd not be able to achieve that resilience, so therefore we're putting at risk the ability to provide water under all circumstances. This is about 1 in 500-year drought resilience that we provide through this scheme.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just emphasise, or get you to emphasise for us, what is going to happen if the scheme, between now and 2040, I mean, Richard Aylard must have come before this committee, I don't know how many times, the previous head of sustainability, to talk about the need for this scheme. And at that time, we were talking about deliverable by 2037. And this committee wrote and said, well, can you bring it forward to 2034 or 2035? We've just had the hottest summer on record with numerous heat waves, and the hottest 5 summers have been in the last 8 years, or whatever
Right.
I can't remember the precise.
2000.
But it's clearly heating up. You're talking about deliverable by 2040. That is 15 years away. What are we going to do in the meantime if there are further summers as hot as this one in a row? I mean, I think that's going to be the real problem, isn't it? Because you're talking about groundwater here, and we're talking about depletion of aquifers. What are we going to do between now and 2040? How are we going to improve resilience before the reservoir comes on stream?
Yeah, no, so it's an important question as well in terms of our plans. So as you would imagine, the reservoir gets us to a point from 2040 onwards. We currently have the Teddington scheme we've talked about for London to improve resilience for 1 in 200 year. That comes in the mid-2030s. About 2033 is currently forecast for that scheme. Alongside that, we have other schemes that we are using to basically maximise what we can take from the environment within our licence requirements, and also improve the resilience of our ability to move it across the region so that we can use it in the places where we need it. So all those schemes are also part of the huge investment we're currently making in water systems for Thames, and working then with our counterparties at Affinity Water and Southern Water.
And where are we now in terms of leakage? Because we had Catherine Ross came to talk to us as the interim co-chief executive and said leakage was at 602 million litres per day, and yet when I was first the chair of this committee between 2016 and 18, it was 500. So it had gone up from 500 to 602. Where are we now? Do you have that figure?
I don't have the precise figure. It's lower than 600. It's around the 550 level from memory.
So it's still gone up from...
But yeah, and again, we've been making progress. We actually had leakage down the lowest level. What we found is that the heat and the soil moisture deficit, how dry the ground is, has had an impact on our pipes. So all those things we are counting
Climate
this year.
change is affecting the leakage as well.
It is. We've got more resources than ever fixing leaks, but it's about making sure that our pipework, our infrastructure is resilient as well against ground movement and against these dry weather that we're facing.
And in terms of the rollout of smart meters, where are we now on that? Because obviously that's the other side of it. The more that people know about the water they're actually using. I mean, I had a meter fitted some time ago, and I have to say my bills plummeted. So, I would strongly advise anybody who, is thinking about getting a meter, it's a really good idea because it makes you very aware of the water that you're using, and water otherwise sort of vanishes down the plug hole, and people just, I don't think, are very aware of how much water they're using.
So smart meters are really important. We put out about 1.1 million so far, 1 million in London in the last year. We're planning another 250,000 smart meters into the Thames Valley over the course of the next year, because we see that as where the challenge is. And they're great, partly because they give customers more information about how they use water, but they also start to give us better information about who uses water and when. So we know, for instance, from smart meters now, that when it gets above 25 degrees ambient temperature, people use 25% more water when they have gardens. So all those pieces sort of align to why we're bringing hosepipe restrictions currently, but understanding that behaviour and understanding how we might help customers use less in terms of being more water efficient, both in the home but outside as well, particularly when it's hot, will all start to take pressure off our systems overall.
Yes, encouraging people to fit water butts so they can use grey water on their garden and all those obvious things.
Exactly.
Can I just ask on a different point? We're talking about progress on the scheme. Where are we in terms of progress on the DCO, Secretary of State support, and being seen as a nationally significant infrastructure project, which I presume this has gone into that category now. Do we see that the Secretary of State is fully supportive of the scheme, and what's the progress on the DCO?
So I'll pass to Robin on progress on the DCO, but yes, we've got full support from Secretary of State and from the Water Minister as well. And as I say, we're working very closely with the DEFRA Water Delivery Task Force now in terms of how do we unlock any challenges and manage risks together to get this scheme delivered. Do you want to pick up on the DCO?
Yeah, sure. So we've been going through a design development exercise over the past number of years to get to the point where we're comfortable with the design we're putting out, which is shown on the screen here, and that informs the statutory consultation itself. As part of that, we've put in the preliminary environmental information report, and that forms, I guess, the basis of a draft environmental statement, so the public can feedback and stakeholders can feedback on what our current plans are. And then we'll take that statutory consultation feedback on board and update the design where necessary, or as someone mentioned previously, we'll put any requirements that come out of that within the consent itself within the DCO.
And what's the time frame on the...
So the DCO should be submitted in November 2026 in terms of the current timescale, and we expect it to be awarded 18 months after that.
Okay, so not until a year's time for submitting for the DCO, and then 18 months, it will take 18 months for it to be granted.
That's what is common with previous DCOs, yeah. We are working, as Neville said, with the Water Task Force, with DEFRA, with government to see how we can reduce that period.
Well, if anyone describes that working at pace, then I'd like to see what working slowly looks like, because that's 2.5 years from now, is I'm hearing. Okay, those are the last of my additional questions just at the end. I'm just going to quickly see if anyone's got anything else they wanted to add. I think Joanne was possibly Zach. No? Okay. Thank you very much to both Rob and Neville from Thames Water for coming in and going through the details. We would strongly encourage Londoners to respond to the consultation, which is now live and is going over the next 10 weeks. I think it's been live for about a week now.
Yes, that's correct, to the 13th of January.
Great. So if you want to respond, it's online and it's available now, and we will consider whether or not we want to put something jointly together from the committee as well. But thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to bang the gavel and we're going to have a small break, and we've got some more guests coming in to talk about heat networks. Thank you.
Thank you.
sorry to go straight into it, but if you don't mind. Could I ask the committee to note the discussion that we just had with Thames Water over the South East Strategic Reservoir option? And could I also ask the committee to delegate authority to me in conjunction with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the previous discussion? Is that agreed? Thank you very much. We've had our short adjournment. And we're now going to move on to a discussion about heat networks in London and how they may or may not be expanded. And I'd like to welcome a new set of guests to today's meeting. We have Caroline Bragg, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Association for Decentralised Energy, known as ADE to its friends, or even AID, possibly. Stephen Knight, lately of this place, although in a slightly different location, and who's the Chief Executive of the Heat Trust. Gareth Jones, who is the founder and managing director of Fair Heat, and online and joining us remotely from, I assume, from Denmark, I'm thinking, is Birger Laursen, and I hope I'm pronouncing that even faintly correctly. You're very welcome. And you are also on silent at the moment. But Birger is the member of the Board of Advisors, Euro Heat and Power, so we should have a more international perspective on the topic as well. So we're going to start with questions, actually, well, we're going to start with the first question, which I'm going to address to everyone, to get everybody into the mood of answering more detailed questions. And that is, what are the benefits, in your opinion, of heat networks as a way of heating homes and buildings? And I'm going to start with Caroline and then work down the line.
Right. Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having us here to talk to you today. If I say briefly, and then I'll hand over. Firstly, we all know that heat decarbonisation is one of the defining challenges of the next 10 to 15 years. It has proved extremely politically difficult, but there is no way that the UK or London can meet its climate change targets without real progress. Heat networks have a significant contribution to play therein, and I'll go through a number of those. Firstly, they are one of the only ways to strategically use waste heat, of which London has ample amounts at the minute that we are not able to use fully, and I'm sure that's something that we will get into in more depth over the course of this morning. Secondly, they also provide a way to decarbonise quite a lot of our buildings, many of which would be more difficult to decarbonise, for example, with commercial heat pumps because of space constraints, for example, or for other reasons. Thirdly, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in terms of the international examples, if you look at heat networks as infrastructure, you are effectively collectivising and outsourcing your way of doing decarbonising heat that creates significant efficiencies. So the technology, the capacity that you need to put in to meet the same level of heat demand is less if you use the properties of network infrastructure than if every single building and household in London had to have an individual air source heat pump or other technology. So in summary, perhaps I'll stop there for now, but we are looking at the only way to use strategic sources of waste heat in London, the only way to decarbonise certain buildings in this capital, and at lower cost than would otherwise have been the case. I can also talk perhaps in detail over the course of this morning about broader system benefits. We all know, for example, about the constraints on our electricity networks, and heat networks offer significant benefits there too.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to move on to Stephen. Do you want to add to what Caroline has said?
Yes, well, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be back, as you say, if not in the same physical location, at least to the committee. And it's good to see a few familiar faces as well. So I think to answer your question about what do heat networks bring, I think one has to start from the situation of, we currently heat our homes using mostly gas boilers, that can't go on indefinitely. We know we need to decarbonise. And heat networks, I think, offer an opportunity to do that at a lower cost than simply putting in electric panel heaters everywhere, and also, frankly, at the lower cost in terms of the amount of electricity that we can physically get around everywhere and distribute energy. So, from my mind, they ought to be done well. Heat networks should be a way of producing decarbonised heat in a way that is low cost for consumers. And fundamentally, it's got to be low cost for consumers if it's going to be politically acceptable and you know, provide the sort of homes, comfortable homes that Londoners and other people need. So there are lots of pros and cons, and there are lots of challenges in delivering that. But fundamentally, it's got to be about the lowest cost way to decarbonise our heating.
I suspect we're going to come back to the point about costs at various points and also the issues about decarbonisation. I'll move on to Gareth. Do you want to add to what Caroline and Stephen have both said?
Morning all. Yeah, I think there are a couple of things just to add on, and I'll probably take a slightly more technical view on some of this. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's... Can you hear that?
I was going to say, if you could move the microphone bite space slightly more towards you so that we can hear you more easily. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of points to add on just around, one on the cost point for consumers. Very much we saw over the last years, we've seen quite a lot of volatility in costs and particularly in heating costs. I think when we're looking to our European counterparts, where they have heat networks, they were insulated from a lot of those costs, so didn't see as much variability, particularly when you're coming back to waste heat sources, for example. Their costs don't shift as much, obviously, over time. There's also the issue on when we're looking at decarbonising, there's the technology you use to decarbonise and the temperatures you run those at. When you're looking at individual heat pump solutions, you typically need to run those at lower temperatures, or you need to go through. And as part of that, quite often there's quite significant fabric improvements that are required. Heat networks can generally be run at a higher temperature because you've got centralised heat pumps, typically boosting, which means you can actually shift back. Either you can avoid some of those fabric improvements, or you can reduce the need for them altogether or push them to later time. And the last one, just in terms of combustion in city centres, referring back to the gas boilers we've typically got, air quality has quite a big impact that we're stepping around that with heat networks.
Okay, although, I mean, there are obviously points that one can say in favour of fabric improvements to insulation, because we're very poor in this country. I think we have the worst insulation of buildings in the whole of Europe, which moves me on to Birger. If you would like to mention a few of the benefits of heat networks from your more European perspective.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, super, great, thank you. Well, I basically agree with what has been said by the three previous speakers, emphasizing the flexibility of the district heating networks, the cost effectiveness, and also the fact that by using waste heat and other local sources, you both create value to what is available locally and save on import, but you also disconnect from international fuel markets. And I can mention from my own country, Denmark, the example during the energy crisis a couple of years ago, when fuel prices went up on gas and other fuels, district heating consumers in Denmark enjoyed relatively modest increases in their heat prices. I think that district heating is run on many different terms across Europe, but I think that the main benefit for countries employing district heating, the Nordic countries in particular, is the use of all these available heat sources, waste heat and so on, but also renewables like to some extent biomass, to some extent waste to energy heat recovery and so on in the heat supply for cities and citizens. The flexibility, I think, is also important. That is something we also see, the ability to use electricity when that is in abundant supply due to the fluctuations of renewables, but also having backup to the heat system. A backup heat supply that would be outrageously costly if you are going to have that on an individual building basis. Apart from that, I think it's the same benefits across Europe that has been mentioned here before.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, and also thank you to all of you for not repeating the points that other people have made. I'm going to start this time with you, Stephen. I'd like to ask you all what the challenges are. So I will actually start with you, Birger, because we took you last. What are the challenges to installing heat networks? When are they suitable as a source of heat, and when are they unlikely to be suitable? Or do you think they can be just used absolutely everywhere?
They cannot be used absolutely everywhere. They can be used in what we call heat-dense areas, typically the inner cities, depending on the available heat sources. I mean, just an extreme example. In Iceland, they have district heating everywhere because you can find geothermal heat everywhere. That is not the case in most of Europe. But if you have an abundant supply of waste heat somewhere, you can extend district heating networks into even smaller towns and villages or suburban areas. That is what we have done in Denmark because we're saturated with district heating. In other countries, like the UK, for instance, I would assume that would not be appropriate go into sort of very heat lean areas. That would probably be more suitable for heat pumps or other solutions. The tricky point in developing district heating is ensuring the critical mass to build the network. As an example, if you build sewage networks, you would make it compulsory for everybody to connect because otherwise they might not, and it would be uneconomical probably to install the network. The same applies for district heating. If you not somehow can ensure that enough consumers connect relatively early on, either you will end up with a unfinancial network with too high heat losses, etc., or it might not be built at all. I think that is the discussion that we hear all over Europe. How do you de-risk these massive investments that have to be recovered over many years?
Thank you. That's a really interesting point about making people connect to make them viable. Do you think, Gareth, that is the main challenge? And would you agree with Birger that the best place for a heat network is somewhere where there's lots of customers and also lots of waste heat available? And we're not planning to install volcanoes all over the UK like they have in Iceland or geothermal?
Yeah. I'll agree. I think in terms of, I don't think it's only where there's waste heat available. I think where we've got renewable sources of heat all around us. We've got the air, we've got water. It's not only waste, so we can extract, and particularly when you get into larger scale, that's often more feasible to do, where you've got, for example, you wouldn't tap into a river as an individual dwelling, whereas actually if you've got a whole series of houses nearby, you can. So I think that's the point. It's not just waste. I think also we need to make a slight distinction here between when we talk heat networks in the UK, particularly when we're looking at regulations, we're talking about district, and that's what we've been talking about here, but there are also communal networks. So we've got a high-density building, so you've got a multi-dwelling building. I think sometimes it actually will make sense to have a heat pump, communal heat pump on that system, even if it's not in a high-density area, wider to share in that particular case. So I think there are some instances where we might want to put in a heat network within the UK context, just in terms of the regulatory definitions there. But I think heat networks, yes, I think they make sense where you've got a relatively high density of heat usage. In terms of challenges, historically one of the challenges has been that we haven't had a regulatory framework for it. I think that's changing now. So we now do have rights and powers coming in. as we have for other utilities, and that's been one of the big blockers we've had in the UK up to now. I think that will take away quite a lot of the blocks we've had to date. Obviously, in city centres, there are other challenges, so you do have coordination issues, traffic, all of those sorts of things, but you have that with any utility that you roll out.
Thank you. Stephen, challenges, are they suitable for everywhere? Do you want to add to what Gareth and Biega have been saying?
Well, I suppose fundamentally you can build a heat network anywhere, and indeed we see examples in Cambridgeshire villages and new towns in Devon where the whole development has been built low density on heat networks, so it can be done anywhere. The question really is, where should it be done? Where's most appropriate? And, you know, typically we tend to see most heat network customers in high density areas because it's more cost effective, and indeed, you know, 51% or thereabouts of heat network customers in the UK are in Greater London. And that, I think, probably underlines that, you know, high density is where heat networks really have their strongest point. But I would overlay on this an issue around cost, because I think heat networks come into play where the heat network is the lowest cost solution. So where you've got a heat source of low cost heat that is cheaper than you can get on an individual basis. So, you know, you might say, well, every flat or home could have its own air source heat pump. And if you did that on a communal basis, actually you could go for a more efficient ground source heat pump that provided cheaper heat, or you might be able to suck heat out of a water source, a reservoir or a river or something like that, and that way lowering the cost of heat. And because there's also to set against this the cost of building the heat network, of course, and running the heat network, which is a cost. And therefore, in order to make it a cost-effective way for consumers, you have to have a lower source of heat in the first place. So if you're simply going from a series of individual gas boilers to a centralised gas boiler, typically that's going to be more expensive to run than the individual gas boilers, because you've got the cost of running the heat network and all the heat losses, transporting the heat around, to overlay on top of that, and you're starting off with a heat source that's the same sort of cost as the individual one. So that doesn't work very well, and indeed a lot of heat networks are like that, unfortunately, at the moment. But if you start off with a low-cost source of heat, then that low-cost source of heat outweighs all those other costs, and you get a lower-cost solution in the end. So it's about, in my view, finding those low-cost sources of heat, and that outweighing the cost of having a heat network and running the heat network and providing lower-cost heat to consumers at the end of the day.
Thank you.
So it's about the right solution for the right homes.
Right, that's very helpful. Caroline, do you want to wrap up on what you think the challenges are, and are heatworks good for everywhere, or are there some places better than others?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Do you want? Sorry, can you turn on your microphone and Stephen turn his off?
Sorry. There we go, perfect. So perhaps I'll just focus on 2 points, I think, in terms of the different types of heat networks and where they work, and then what we see is really the core challenge at the minute in the UK. So, as we've mentioned, but just to reiterate, there are different types of heat networks, and they are used in different areas. So we can use shared ground loops, for example, where you are sharing infrastructure that comes from using ground source heat pumps that make use of the fact that actually the ground is a more stable temperature than you would get in the air, and that creates efficiencies. And what we often see there, for example, is they've been used well in social housing, for example, and in slightly lower density areas. Then, as Gareth said, we've got communal heat networks. They've been used very effectively in London, particularly for new build flats, for example, and kind of denser areas like that. And then we've got district heating. I have to say, for our Danish colleagues, our district heating is still quite small compared to international examples. We could go much bigger than we are currently doing. But district heat networks are used best, as the panel has said, where we have dense demand areas and particularly a source of waste heat, or the use of large air source heat pumps. What I would say, I think, I think the only thing I would say on this, to add to the rest of the panel, The UK is quite different in terms of how it is aiming to expand and develop this infrastructure, in the sense of we are going low carbon very, very quickly as we build out this major source of infrastructure. Lots of other countries have put infrastructure in the ground to start with, using gas, for example, using other sources of heat, and then have decarbonised over time. We are trying to do all of it all at the same time, which is what we should do, but it raises challenges when, for example, particularly with commercial buildings, with existing domestic dwellings, for example, flats, the legal counterfactual remains gas boilers, and where at the minute gas is relatively cheap and doesn't face the cost of its carbon. So being able to compete properly against a kind of artificially low counterfactual is difficult. And what we are finding, I guess, just to kind of bring this out more clearly, we probably have about £5 billion that has come into this market in the UK overall over the last few years through a mix of balance sheet as well as private equity investment. That is looking to allocate to new heat network infrastructure. But this cost of heat remains a challenge to deploying that capital, including in large schemes in London.
Well, just on the point of large schemes in London, the Mayor has a target for 460,000 new heat network connections in London by 2030. We're virtually at the end of 2025, so in my maths that means there's 4 years to do that. So that's over 100,000 new connections a year. How realistic do you think that target is, Caroline?
So I think we can get there, but it's ambitious, and it does mark a change to the way in which we have gone about things, I think, to date. A lot of connections in London have been driven by new build, very successfully through the planning regime, and we expect that to continue to a point, albeit noting, that higher energy efficiency standards might mean there's less heat demand within those buildings. But the real shift that we need to see over the next 5 and then into the 2030s is a shift into the retrofit market, so effectively decarbonising our existing building stock in the capital. What you can see there, we have a number of schemes that are now underway, and really exciting ones, actually. So if you look, for example, near Spitalfields, we've got Citogen, which has been there for some time. They've just put an amazing 4 megawatt heat pump that's using the heat from London's aquifer to give more stable and lower cost heat. That's looking to expand into homes and buildings around that area. We have the expansion of the Olympic Park, for example, and we also have, for example, in northwest London, Old Oak and Park Royal, which I'm sure you're aware of, but is a really fascinating scheme. It's using the enormous expansion of data centres in that area alongside, what is really, I was there a month or so ago, and really ambitious plans for development of residential and commercial buildings there to build a large heat network, as well as the one in Westminster, for example. So we have these big schemes that are starting to develop. We have loads of low-carbon communal heat networks that are also underway. But there needs to be a real step change, and in particular, there needs to be a resolution to the cost of heat to get us there.
So would you say that the current trajectory of new heat networks in London is such that we can definitely get to this 460,000 new heat connections?
Maybe you ask me straight after the budget and we'll see.
Okay.
But there are the challenges
we're
around...
on the way, but you couldn't definitely 100% say that we would get there.
No, I think there are challenges. I think we are making really good progress. And whilst, the targets are ambitious, we have seen some of the largest heat networks to be kind of announced over the last few years in this capital. But we need to resolve challenges around the cost of heat to really make this go.
Okay. Stephen, I want to ask you, what is the best way to decarbonise existing heat networks? And I want to ask Gareth as well.
Yes, and I think it's interesting you referred to the Mayor's target as well of 460 new connections. I think an awful lot of what we will see in terms of the rollout of district heating in central London will be absorbing lots of communal heated buildings, which currently have their own gas boilers, heating a block of flats. And in a sense, that isn't really a new heat network connection, because that's already a heat network. So what we essentially are seeing is a lot of merging and decarbonising of existing heat network connections.
So moving from an existing high carbon heat network to a decarbonised or low carbon heat network.
So I think if one would look at that happening, I certainly think 400,000 is the sort of figure you could well get to. I think to say whether you're going to get 460,000 new heat network connections, I think would be quite a stretch. First of all, most new heat network connections that we see at the moment are new build properties in high density developments. Well, there's lots of those in London.
Sure, as Caroline
and
was
if you look at all of the kind of big development sites, the Old Oak Common, the Barking Riversides, the Nine Elms and so on, you get to probably about 250,000 of those big high density homes being built. Now, whether they're all going to be built by 2030, I doubt. I think some of the Old Oak Common is supposed to get there by 2040. So you're not probably going to get all of that 250,000 new homes by 2030, and therefore not all of the new heat network connections by 2030. And that only gets you some of the way to 460. I think to get that far, you'd have to do a lot of retrofitting of homes which are not currently on heat networks.
Okay.
And we do see some of that at the moment. I can point to some examples. So, there's places like the Lisson Estate in Westminster that is being...
Let's not go into too much detail.
So there are some examples of retrofit going on at the moment, but relatively small. And we'd have to see that scale up very substantially to get anywhere near that. And as you say, we've only got 5 years to go. I think we'd also need significant heat network connections from other developments going on outside of the big redevelopment schemes. But whether that you can get to the 460... that's a pretty stretched target. But what I would say is let's start from the position of an understanding of how many Londoners currently are on heat networks. Because I think the data on this is sometimes difficult to interpret. But the official data says there are 243,000 homes in London with a heat network connection. What I would say, though, is that data is widely considered to be a vast underestimate, and the likely figure is much more likely to be somewhere like 400,000 homes in London on heat networks. Existing homes at the moment on heat networks. And we know it's an underestimate for two reasons, one of which is essentially the government did a census of heat networks in 2015 and another one in about 2020. And it showed actually the number of heat networks falling, strangely. But heat networks haven't disappeared. So what's actually happened is there's been a large amount of non-reporting of heat networks, and there's been very little enforcement of the organisation that was doing that, from the organisation that was doing that. So we know that we've got under-reporting, and I can give you a couple of examples where in Lambeth the number of heat networks fell by 150 allegedly 150 between 2015 and 2020. Now, actually, Lambeth Council runs 150 heat networks, and they hadn't actually got round to re-registering them. So there's all sorts of under-reporting. But we do know that there's actually been a growth in the number of heat network connections, and there are lots of proxies for that we can look at, like the sale of the heat interface units that are used to interface homes to heat networks at around 50,000 a year across the UK. So we know there's been growth. And we also can look at EPC data, which is public, and that says whether the home is connected to a communal heat system. And so there's been a couple of studies that have shown that actually we think that there are roughly under-reporting by a factor of 2. So that gets us to something like 400,000 homes in London.
I mean, we almost seem to be saying that we can get to the mayoral 460,000 target by recording the existing heat networks that are the connections.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would count as a new connection, but yes, we can get to 400,000. I think right now in London just by finding those that haven't been notified, and that's about 1 in 10 London homes currently on a heat network. So we're not starting from a zero base in the capital.
Not here.
At all. So we've got a lot of Londoners currently living with heat networks.
Gareth, I just wanted to come to you finally on this question about the best way to decarbonise existing heat network systems. Any thoughts on that? Hopefully ones that we know about.
Yeah, I think scale has a really big impact, and that's what Caroline was mentioning earlier. that when we look at our district systems in the UK, I don't think they're in London, they wouldn't really count as large district systems on a sort of European scale. If you go to somewhere like Copenhagen and look there, what you start getting by getting very large networks, then you get the ability, and what we've seen over the last decade is, really as people have looked to decarbonise in Europe, is adding lots of different sources of generation into their networks. They're adding heat pumps here. We got mentioned earlier about you can use low-cost electricity. So once you start getting thermal stores, so you can actually get a thermal storage area, when the wind's blowing, the price of electricity drops, you can charge in and store at that point. So that's where it could be heat pumps. It could actually be straight electric boilers. If you get to a significant, low enough price, you can charge in and use. So I think there are lots of opportunities like that. I think it really does come back to, and this is what Stephen was mentioning earlier, what's available to you around? Do I have a water source nearby? Can I use that? Because I can structure that. And with heat networks, what we are seeing in terms of international literature is they're not using one single source. We're seeing very much, as you decarbonise, building in lots of different types of generation as you go. Okay. That might be some air source heat pumps, it might be data centres. We're seeing some great data centre examples. It could be, I've got a sugar refinery sitting on a bank here, so I can bring in the heat from that. So I think there are lots of those examples, and we can see them in London.
So it's the diversity of the sources. Is that something that you would agree with, Birger, that is that what Denmark has done? It's had a diversity of sources of heat to fuel the numerous and much larger heat networks that you have?
100%. We have spent 40 years developing our heat networks, and I would argue that we sort of had changed either fuel or technology roughly every 10 years over the past 40 years or something like that. The current craze is exactly electricity. Electrical boilers, a quite opportunistic technology, you could say, producing heat on electricity when it's very cheap, when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and storing that heat for hours or maybe over the night in large storage tank in district heating. Here in Copenhagen, they have a plan for, I think it's in pounds, that would be 300 million pounds or something like that, investing over the coming years in electrical boilers and storage facilities. I fully agree with what has been said. I would just mention one thing: be careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Because there is a lot of the existing heat production facilities that you might want to leave in place as the backup capacity. We have some systems here that are using ancient boilers because they will only be running a few hours a year as the backup when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, the waste incineration might be out of service or something like that. And in some cases might even be the boiler in a communal heat system, as you have what we tend to call block heating over here. Make sure that you look at this as a gradual development. There's I see a lot of schemes around Europe where people try to go for the perfect solution right away, and it is extremely costly. Make sure you use what you already have. That is the reason we have so much district heating here. We have spent 40 years, we have had waste heat from combined heat and power, etc., finance the grid because that heat otherwise had no value. So make sure you have a sort of a gradual transition towards your target, rather than trying to throw out what you might have and replacing with the perfect solution. That is probably what I would say right now.
Thank you. That's a very interesting and helpful perspective. I'm now going to move on to my colleagues to pick up the questioning, and we're going to start with Assembly Member Thomas Turrell.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the panel. I'm going to start with some questions to Caroline and Stephen. So, kicking off first with, as recently as July this year, the BBC has shared stories of Londoners who are facing huge bills, about £3,500 a year for communal heating and hot waters. Londoners reading such stories will likely be very concerned. How widespread are these cases? If we start with Caroline and then go to Steve.
Sure. So I would say that the most extensive study that has been done into heat network pricing was back in 2018 when the Competition and Markets Authority investigated the sector. What that found is that there is no instances where excessive profits are being made in the sector, but there are instances where poor technical design and implementation and installation have led to a situation where the heat network efficiency is very poor. That coupled with relatively simple procurement practices that we see amongst particularly, say, some smaller operators of heat networks has meant that there are instances of high bills. What I would say, there's a couple of things I think to note on this. The first is that technical standards will come in to force for this sector over the course of the next sort of year or so, and then fully over the course of the sort of latter part of the 2020s. That will be hugely important in making sure that everyone is getting a fair price when they are on heat networks, and will drive out some of the inefficiencies that we've seen that has caused that. Secondly, this sector has not traditionally been regulated by Ofgem, as, for example, gas and electricity has been. What we saw during the energy crisis was very interesting, actually. So there are different ways in which heat is priced within heat networks.
Sorry, just to say, we will be coming on to Ofgem and the impact that will have in a moment,
okay,
so
perfect.
I'll save...
Well, I wanted to note that anyway, and that customer regulation will be coming in the next couple of years. It will not be introducing a price cap. They consider that premature for the market that we see at the minute, but it will look and police pricing in this sector.
Anything to add, Stephen?
Yeah, I think you raised a very good point, and that is that sadly, we've seen quite a lot of examples, particularly in the last few years, since the energy crisis hit in the latter part of 2021. We've seen some quite unfortunate examples of extremely high bills for people on communal and district heat systems, not just in London, but across the UK. And I think the underlying issue behind that is that a heat network, typically operated by a landlord of a building, that landlord buys the energy for that heat network. And most heat networks in London right now are heated by gas, either gas CHP plants or probably mostly gas boilers, particularly for the smaller ones. So large-scale gas boilers and gas plants. The gas that they procure to drive that heat is procured on the non-regulated commercial energy markets. So it's not subject to the domestic price cap. And what the domestic price cap and the other measures the government put in place during the energy crisis did very much was to damp down a volatile market and hold that price down at a time when it was going, in the commercial market, was going ballistic. And you may have seen lots of businesses complaining about the volatile and high nature of energy during that period. And people on heat networks, their heating bills were driven by the commercial energy prices. So we saw even quite large heat network operators like local authorities in London at the height of that period buying their gas on the commercial markets at a higher price than you or I, who were buying it through price-capped market, could get gas. And that led, coupled with, as Caroline said, some of the inefficiencies and heat losses. I mean, you get a certain amount of heat loss with any heat network in terms of getting the heat from the heat source to the home. That's inevitable. But it can be, as I'm sure Gareth can tell you in great detail, because he's the expert on this, you can get those heat losses down very dramatically from what we see quite typically in a lot of the systems that developers have put in. And just to give you an example, it's not that uncommon to see a system, a communal heating system that's been built in the last decade or so that only operates about 35% efficiency. And couple that with really high gas prices and you get very high heat costs. And so we've had this kind of perfect storm of high costs over the last few years, and we still see even now quite, typically higher than cost of heat than you would get from a gas boiler for most heat network customers. Not all, but probably for most. It's much better than it was, but it's still too high. And part of the problem is that we still don't have plans in place to regulate and the kind of volatility and the high costs in the commercial energy market for heat networks. And I think that's something the government needs to move on. And secondly, we've still got too many inefficient heat networks, and that is something the government is moving on with regulation, but it's going to take a long time to sort out because it's going to involve large-scale retrofit of a lot of existing heat networks at cost, and there's a huge question mark over who's going to pay for that work. It's desperately needed to get these costs down, but if we're not careful, we could see particularly leaseholders and social landlords having very big capital bills, and it's not quite clear whether it's going to be paid for. So there are big challenges about getting the costs down, and ultimately we need to move away from this expensive gas, which is the driver of it.
No, I think those are important points, especially around the importance of us needing to be much more resilient as a country with this. So moving on to the next point, which is keeping with Stephen and Caroline for the moment, is Citizens Advice have a role as the official statutory advocate for heat network customers. What does that role mean in practice, if we start with Stephen and then go to Caroline?
Yeah, so this is really good news, and it's new. It's only started in April this year. What that means in practice is that they have funding from Ofgem or the Department for Energy to provide advice and support to heat network customers, just as electricity and gas customers have had for many years, and something which heat network customers haven't had until now. And you know, to really learn from the experiences that they're getting from heat network customers and feed that back into development. We at Heat Trust have been doing this on a very, as best we can on a small scale for years. Not because we're set up to do that or funded to do that, but because there was nobody else out there who was actually able to talk to customers about heat network issues and to explain to customers often who didn't really understand why their bills were high or why they were getting treated in the way they were, what the nature of a heat network was often. So we've been trying to engage with customers, but we're a very small team, and it's not our core. Our core function is to provide a consumer protection scheme for heat networks, and only about probably 1 in 10 heat network customers are covered by that scheme. But most of our time talking to customers was actually customers who weren't. And so it's really helpful that they're there and they're doing this now and be able to support customers. And alongside that, of course, there's also the Energy Ombudsman is able to do dispute resolution for the first time from April this year for heat network customers as well. That, again, is really good move. It's not everything that we need by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a really good step in the right direction.
Anything to add, Caroline?
No, I think Stephen's well covered it.
Perfect. Then we move on to what I promised you around the with Ofgem becoming the regulator as of the 27th of January next year. Will this make any difference to price, and if so, how? And if you want to start.
Sure. So the sector really welcomes the introduction of customer regulation into this sector. I think it's going to be hugely important, both for customers, but I think what is often neglected to be said is that it also gives investors confidence to be part of a regulated market and puts us on the same footing as gas and electricity. So overall, very, very supportive. In terms of where we will go on price, so as Stephen has said, we are not in a situation where the Ofgem regulation will include the introduction of a price cap, although that is part of the primary legislation if governments and Ofgem were to choose to introduce that at a later date. What it will do is firstly, introduction of technical standards will come underneath the umbrella of regulation and are hugely important, as we've talked about, both for new schemes as well as ensuring that the existing schemes that we have are brought up to standard. Secondly, it will also mean that Ofgem starts to gather significantly more data on pricing and the operation of schemes than we have ever had so far. As Stephen mentioned, the only legal requirement at the minute for heat networks is to tell OPSS, the Office of Product Standards and Safety, I think, that you exist, and that is not well enforced currently. This is a totally different regime. There will be ongoing data requirements, particularly around price benchmarking, that will be used by Ofgem to do risk-based audits to look at pricing. I would just say, though, just to highlight, we do not see excessive profits in this sector. That is not one of the challenges that we had. And indeed, the latest research from DESNZ has shown that on average, heat network customers pay about £100 less than those that are on individual schemes.
Anything to add, Stephen?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think fundamentally the framework being introduced to regulate pricing from end of January next year doesn't bring in any real new rules around price. So yes, heat networks are going to have to report what their prices are, and Ofgem will have the ability to analyse all that data, because currently we have no real data on our real database on heat network prices. So that will be available. The regulator will have the power to look at that database and to look for outliers and examine trends, all the rest of it. But there are no real rules, right? So it's not, we're not going to see prices fall on at the end of January next year. There's nothing in the regulations to do that, and there's no real equivalent to the price cap that the domestic gas and electricity customers benefit from. There will be, as I said, new rules around technical standards, but realistically, it's going to take a decade for existing heat networks to be brought up to those kind of standards. That's going to be a slow reduction in inefficiency and heat losses over a period, because it takes, people are going to have to do physical works to heat networks to deliver that. So that's not going to lower prices overnight. It's a long-term process of lowering prices. And as I've said, and what I've said to government numerous times, is we need an equivalent to the price cap for heat network customers. And in my mind, that's about capping the price of fuel that heat networks buy. So the gas and the electricity that they use in their energy centres should be price capped in the same way that domestic energy is price capped. The government have committed to do a call for evidence around this sometime next year. It's very, very loose at the moment, but I'm hoping there will be moves in this direction. But certainly at the moment, there are no plans as part of regulation to really to tackle cost, I'm afraid. And so, we've got a period. And on top of that, of course, there's a lot of debt being built up by consumers because of these costs. And, you mentioned some of that have been on the news. Customers who are heat network customers with a lot of debt face, in some ways, a higher detriment than if you're a gas or electricity customer in debt, because often your debt is to your landlord. And quite often that means that your home is at risk if you don't pay, in a way that it wouldn't be at risk if you didn't pay your gas or electricity supplier. And so there are real issues, and the high costs also that we've talked about have led to some quite big arrears building up. Now, Ofgem has a debt relief strategy that it's working on for the energy sector right now, but it appears that isn't going to cover heat network consumers, despite the fact they're going to be the regulator for heat networks as well as gas and electricity. So that kind of debt relief, which I think is desperately needed in the heat network sector to clear some of the backlog from of debt from the energy crisis last few years, we've not, it looks like we're not going to get it. So I think there is that outstanding problem that needs to be addressed, and government needs to do more to get there.
Thank you for those answers. So, sticking with you, Stephen, but adding Gareth, to go into Stephen and Gareth for these next few questions. Then, what are the key factors that will influence future price that consumers will pay for heat from heat networks? If we start with Gareth this time.
Yeah, I think, and again, when we're thinking of price and what consumers are paying, I think we need to, again, have in mind, and we heard before that it's referenced as block heating in other countries, but here it's communal heating. There's a price of what does it cost to generate heat and deliver it to buildings, and then what's the cost to then distribute it within those buildings to end consumers, taking consideration that most of those end consumers will be within multi-apartment blocks. When we're looking at the price of generation, obviously there is one of the big factors comes to what's your input fuel or what's your input sources. Obviously waste heat, where you can utilise that may have a different cost profile to where we have, for example, electricity as an input. Within low carbon setting, I think we need to take this into consideration of what's the counterfactual. So what are we comparing here? Are we looking at an individual air source heat pump for an individual home versus with some top up? Almost always you can have some top up direct electric within that, within the for the hot water side, versus what are we looking at for the central fuels? So that's obviously a big driver, and coming back to the comments that Stephen's just made before. The other point then comes back to how efficiently is that energy then used and distributed within the network itself. And I think that's the one where, when we've been looking, and the comments been made about different levels of efficiency historically, where we're looking at new build developments going forward or new networks, I think the framework that's being put in place through the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme is a big step forward. We have, at the moment in London, we have some fantastic examples of very, very high performance heat networks. We've been to international conferences, presented them, and people sit up and look at them and go, oh wow, that's really impressive. We do have that, but that's on a voluntary basis here at the moment. What we're putting in place is a framework that effectively lifts the bottom up in terms of saying, this is a minimum technical standard, these are the maximum losses that you can actually have on your network. That then gets measured, and it gets measured on an ongoing basis. So I think that deals with a lot of the concerns that we have there. Take into consideration what Stephen was saying before, it will take some time for existing networks to bring them up to speed as well. And that will work through the system over a decade. But for new networks, I think we've got that in place. It then comes back to what are we comparing back against. And I think this is where we come back to the counterfactual. The reality is we effectively have gas at an artificially low price. If we require all new networks to be 100% electric, for example, from the start, and we don't allow any contribution from fossil fuel assets. So, for example, and I think this is the point being made of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What we see is that you get very, very large, the peak demand you get on networks will last for hours in a year. And the cost of, if you're going to provide all of that by low carbon technology, that means actually a lot of your grid capacity is being taken up by that, and you're actually putting very, very large plants. So there is definitely an argument, particularly over a transition period, to step things through over time and use some of that capacity over that initial period until we're built up.
Thank you. Anything to add, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot's been said. I mean, the other issue I think is fundamentally about price in the new environment of low carbon heat is storage is your friend, because if you can store heat that you can generate off peak, it's going to be an awful lot cheaper than trying to generate heat at peak hours, because if you've got electrified heat sources, heat pumps and so on. And I think one of the concerns I have is that whilst we've got policies which drive developers to install low carbon technologies, we don't necessarily have policies that drive them to install low cost low carbon technologies. So, for example, if you're building a block of flats and you put in an air source heat pump system on the roof that's going to generate the heat to heat the buildings, there's nothing forcing you to put a big water tank, hot water store in the basement, right? But by doing so, you could provide that heat off peak at a much lower cost to the residents. And one of the problems in this sector is that these schemes are built by developers, and developers are driven by how much profit can be made out of this scheme, how can we build it at the lowest cost whilst ticking all the boxes. And so we've often seen things that would drive lower cost heat, like thermal store in the basement, excluded, because actually it's a cost to the developer they don't have to do, but it's a big cost to the consumer long term not having it. And I think it's that kind of thing we need to get smarter at, ensuring that schemes are built for the benefit of consumers long term, not just ticking boxes in order to get things through planning and so on.
Well, thank you.
So can I just come in on that? Because I think it's it's a really important point, and I think it comes back to when we're looking at larger scale. particularly as a Londoner living here, I think we need to be thinking much more strategically about where those large thermal stores are located. And I think it's very, very difficult. I work a lot with a lot of developers. When you're looking at an individual plot, they can't make those sorts of decisions. And I think we do need to be looking at a sort of more regional scale of where do we utilise what assets and put in those sorts of assets, because that will have a very large impact on costs.
Thank you for those answers and that addition. One thing I've been surprised about in these answers, we've heard about things that will help bring down prices eventually, with that eventually being the key point, which is obviously not very reassuring to people stuck paying high price at the moment. But we know that one thing that does bring down prices, it does improve the customer experience and lead to more transparency, is particularly around how do you get more competition into the market. And I know that the Competition Authority has been doing some work into that, but I haven't heard any reference to that in any of the answers so far. So I just wanted to throw that open if anybody had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, fundamentally, if your heating is provided on a communal basis, then you're not going to get to choose, which source of heat you get as a resident. So you don't get to pick and choose your heat supplier. Typically, it's your building owner. Although if you're on a larger district heat network, it might be the company that's built and developed that bigger network. I think there is an issue around if we're moving more to a utility-wide district heat system serving many parts of the city. If we could see millions of Londoners, essentially having this as another utility service with their home connected. I think one of the things we are largely doing as we develop this out is there will be private companies building these things and competing for the contracts to build these things. Now, whether that's a way of driving down costs or not, I think is an open question. I mean, if you take the example of Europe, virtually all district heat networks are municipally owned. We're pretty unique in the UK in driving a big expansion of district heating across our cities on a privately owned basis, privately financed basis. And if we look at our existing experience of utilities like water, for instance, I'm not convinced necessarily that's had the best outcome for consumers long term. So we might want to question some of these issues about where the interest of consumers lies. Energy is not going to be cheap, I think, in the near future. We need to do a lot to decarbonise things. Heat is a form of energy. Electricity, I don't think, is going to be dirt cheap. So we need to make sure we're doing these things at the lowest cost as a society for all, because consumers are ultimately going to pay for it. Pay their electricity bills, going to pay their heat bills, going to pay their water bills. We're not in a world in which these costs are trivial. So, driving down unnecessary costs is really important. So financing this at the lowest possible cost is going to be really important for consumers, and not having entities trying to profiteer out of it long term is probably going to have, a better outcome for consumers. How we deliver that is, of course, a challenge.
Caroline, you've indicated.
Sure, yes. So I think to Stephen's point, maybe I'll pick up a couple of things. It's really important when we talk about heat networks that we have in our mind the infrastructure that we are building. We are effectively building systems here that connect heat through networks into buildings. And what we've seen, obviously, when we look at electricity, gas, for example, we have managed those through monopolies and through Ofgem regulation. The first thing I would say to add to Stephen's point, so the development of zoning is really important as part of this. What that means is, effectively regional planning that will identify where heat networks are best, lots of which will be in the capital, and I know the GLA has very strong ambitions for its role within that. That will be procured and then confer rights to connect to buildings within London and elsewhere on a competitive basis. And a big part of that will be ensuring that there are good prices, fair prices for consumers. The second thing I would say, I think, with this is it is really important to understand the context that we are in, particularly for larger, new, low-carbon heat networks. We are in a situation at the minute where we are competing and fighting very hard against a counterfactual that does not consider its carbon costs. And so lots of the developments that we are seeing, there is intense pressure to reduce cost because that counterfactual is so low. And, you know, when we see, for example, the newer schemes, for example, OPDC, Citigen, etc., all have thermal stores, for example, as we've talked about, to make use of lower cost electricity, to learn the lessons internationally. So I think it is important to understand the context that we're in and what we're competing against in terms of price.
Thank you for those. Now, just in the interest of time, if I could ask that you write to us with any more information on what can be done to lower price, and particularly what government and the GLA can do to influence the price of heat networks.
Thanks, Tom. That's really helpful because obviously we are a bit delayed because of the delayed start. I'm going to move straight on to Assembly Member Polanski, who's going to ask some questions about the international comparators that we were literally just referring to.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I can pick up there with Vyberger in Denmark. We were talking there about monopolies. I believe you're a not-for-profit sector. How important is ownership and governance across Europe in getting this right?
Honestly, it's very difficult to say because district heating has been developed and does exist on very different terms across Europe. In Denmark, we have, as you said, non-profit regulation introduced as a consequence of us pushing people into district heating. When we push district heating into district heating through mandatory connection and that kind of thing, we have to offer them some kind of protection. And just a correction here: one third of the district heating in Denmark is delivered by consumer-owned cooperatives. So there is private ownership in district heating in other countries, at least in Denmark. But all networks are covered by the same regulation. When we look at other countries, we see Finland, Sweden, Germany have commercial district heating, not regulated other than through the standard competition legislation. We have seen debate on this in all countries. I am aware of investigations carried out by monopoly regulators in those countries. I've seen a particularly strong debate in Sweden where district heating is not so much sold to individual homes as in Denmark, but more to sort of business-to-business transaction, where there's a discussion on, again, some kind of mediation scheme when it comes to price and terms and things like that. It's so different across Europe, the ownership and the way it's organized. But you also have to take into account what are the competition, you could say, to district heating. In Sweden, for instance, there is only electricity. They don't have natural gas. In Denmark, we don't have competition between gas and district heating because heat planning have set areas aside for each. In Germany, they might have a district heating and gas in the same street. So the competition might be different there. Who are the customers? Is it just individuals like myself? I live in a detached house. I have district heating. Or is it in Sweden where it is building owners that are more professional and more resourceful than individuals like myself? So I think, this debate really has to be based on the terms or sort of the conditions where you want to develop district heating. And just one thing also to add, district heating in Denmark, the regulation there we're talking about district networks selling to buildings, whereas internally in building, the relations there between tenants and the building owner is regulated by a separate law, and that is regulated regardless of the heat source of that building. So it's difficult, I would say, to sort of extract one lesson from all of Europe. If I should give an advice, look at the Dutch. They are in a similar situation like the UK. They want to develop district heating. They have gas everywhere, and they have a strong discussion on how do we actually facilitate the development of this.
Thank you. I hear that's a mixed picture. Could you give me an example of anywhere in Europe that is expanding heat networks and keeping consumer prices low?
Denmark. but because we are currently expanding district heating in an effort to get rid of individual gas. I think we have 10-15% of homes still connected to gas. 70% are already on district heating. But that is, I mean, you cannot compare developing district heating on such a solid base as we have here with regulation in place and everybody knows what it is, that kind of thing. And then the situation some other countries are in. The Dutch, as I mentioned, the French have also ambitions here. The Austrians, whomever can I name, the Germans, but lots of countries have in Germany, the policy is different between the individual lender in Germany. Some have put a regulation in place similar to ours. Others are not quite there yet and so on. You can find so many ways of doing it, but everybody's aiming at providing the lowest heat price or the best, most affordable solution, and at the same time moving in the direction of the energy transition.
Although, can I just pick up on that? So we were asked about monopoly, and the first part of this meeting that was unrelated was around water. And we've seen in this country what happens when you have a privatised monopoly. You end up with crap in the river. Would you have similar fears about monopolies?
Personally, yes. But I'm also aware, for instance, both the cities of Hamburg and Berlin have bought back the district heating networks from commercial operators in those towns. They sold them and insisted on buying them back. And I think in this country there is absolutely no debate on privatizing district heating here, because in Denmark we consider district heating a monopoly. It's not really being debated at all. In Sweden, they have a debate because they, in some cases you could argue that it would be possible to replace your district heating connection in the basement, the heat exchanger, with a heat pump, because electricity is cheaper and available, the grid is strong and things like that. So again, it depends a little bit on the local circumstances.
That's helpful. And the final question, is there an optimal size for a heat network?
No, we have our smallest member is 150 consumers, something like that, in a small town, run entirely by the board members of the board of a small consumer cooperative. And then at the other end, we have district heating all over Copenhagen. A third of Paris, I believe, is heated by district heating. Beijing, Moscow, any size is feasible, really depending on local circumstances.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Polansky. That was very effective questioning. I'd like to move on to Assemblymember Joanne McCartney now.
Thank you. I want to ask about heat network zoning. And we know the 23 Act talked about having a lot more of these zones. Can I just ask you all briefly, just how do you expect that the heat network zoning will work in London? And if it is already, how's it doing?
Shall I start? So we're not quite there yet. So what we are doing at the minute, as you rightly say, primary legislation came in through the Energy Act 2023, and government is busy at the minute developing the secondary legislation that will put that into effect. But we have advanced zoning pilots at the minute that are starting to test some of the principles around heat network zoning. There are a couple of kind of fundamental pillars of how zoning will work in the capital. So the first thing is that there will be DESNZ and the Central Authority will act as a kind of overall coordinator, setting national standards by which procurement happens, for example, of some of these larger heat networks, as well as setting mandation for buildings to connect, as well as the terms by which waste heat should connect to networks. So that's the first thing. We are also likely to have local authorities, and the GLA in particular, is likely to take a very strong role here in acting as a local coordinator in the capital. And what that will mean in practice is probably with DESNZ is procuring large zones and conferring those rights to the developers who win, engagement with businesses and other buildings that will be affected by that, and also, crucially, acting as some of the what we call anchor loads, so some of the big heat demand buildings with large heat demand who will form some of the first parts of the network. The public sector will play a really important role in acting as some of those first anchor loads to get the networks underway. So that is how we're assuming it's going to work. I think for the GLA and for London overall, zoning is really, really important, because when you look, for example, at the waste heat maps that have been produced and some of the research and work done to date by the GLA, what you see is really a very fascinating picture of very significant sources of heat, whether that's energy from waste, for example, data centres, sewage treatment, in particular areas of London, particularly North London, into the west, down south, and then very significant demand loads, particularly as you get towards central London. So in the capital, perhaps more than anywhere else, this is a coordination kind of challenge across different boroughs, across London as a whole, and one that has been difficult in the past to really get over. What we've seen is very successful networks being developed. For example, Energetic in Enfield uses energy from waste. Just to our Danish colleagues, they were able to keep prices down during the energy crisis because they had that waste heat. What London really needs is the ability to expand and move that heat south towards denser areas in central London that don't have their own heat sources. But we can't do that at a borough level. There needs to be regional coordination and a way in which this actually works fairly for everyone.
So you're saying that we do just need one coordinator for London, basically?
I think in practice what's going to happen is, the GLA will take a lead, and there will be very significant engagement with the local boroughs, as I said, because of the buildings that they own, because of their relationships with businesses and residents.
Okay, lovely. And Stephen, yeah.
Yes, and I think we've been waiting, for a year now for the government's response to the zoning consultation. I did a public consultation, and it hasn't yet published the outcome of that consultation. And hopefully that will clear up some of these issues about governance, because whilst local authorities are going to be zone coordinators, I think is what the government proposed, it's not clear in the context of London actually whether the GLA has a role, or what role the GLA has in relation to boroughs. But obviously, with a lot of district heat systems, they cross borough boundaries. We see examples like Selchip in South London, where the waste incinerator is in Lewisham, but the homes being heated are in Southwark. So, it wouldn't make sense to have zone coordinators that are just borough-wide. So I think you're either seeing sub-regional partnerships coming together around specific district heat networks being developed, or, ultimately what we probably will see is all of the various sort of sub-regional district heat networks being merged together over time. You could well have a single district heat network covering the whole of central London at some point, or even the whole of Greater London eventually. And, does it make sense, therefore, for individual boroughs to be doing the zone coordination role, or even groups of boroughs? And I think probably what we need, particularly at a strategic level, is strategic oversight from the mayor or the GLA around London's strategic heat zone plans. You might well have localised versions of that at borough level or sub-regional level as well, but I think it's going to be really important that the mayor plays a really big role, and I think particularly in terms of identifying low-cost sources of heat and often piping them in to where they're needed. You can see technically you can pipe heat quite long distances, and you certainly see examples in Denmark, I believe, of heat being piped tens of miles or more from a heat source into cities. So one could see examples of low cost heat coming from future small modular reactors in the home counties piped into London. Who knows? But any source of low carbon heat that you can find that's low cost ought to be kind of, directed into where it's most needed. And I think one can see that kind of big scale planning really has to sit at a strategic London-wide level. And so I'm sure the mayor would want to do that, but clearly the boroughs have to be involved at the local level in terms of delivery of their little, their bit of it.
Thank you. If Gareth, you wanted to add anything? No.
I just think to come back to just extending on from what Stephen was saying there, I think we will at some point look to have transmission networks of, and I think this is one of the things we need to be looking at is how do we shift, large amounts of probably slightly higher temperature heat from sources across London and then into local distribution. So I think we might need to be thinking of transmission and distribution separately within that, particularly as we move forward.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you.
Sorry, just to add to that as well, large-scale storage of heat as well as transmission is going to be important as well, because we have lots of surplus heat in the summer, and we need lots of heat in the winter, right? So have a huge seasonal store, dump all your waste heat in the summer, use it in the winter, and particularly if you've got a kind of constant source of waste heat from a data centre or something, it'd be pointless to not be storing half of that during the summer.
Thank you. I think most of the questions in my section have actually been answered in various forms.
Thank you. I think that's also really helpful. We've had some very helpful answers. Tom Turrell, did you want to come back in? OK. In which case, I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Gareth Roberts.
Morning. GLA supported the expansion of heat networks through policies in the London Plan and through the local area energy planning. And it's a question really about how effective do you believe that support has been? Question for anybody.
Shall I start, and then I'll defer to colleagues. I think what you can see, and as we've talked about in terms of the concentration of heat networks in London compared to the rest of the UK, the GLA has used planning very effectively to promote particularly communal heat networks where they are best, and obviously with a strategic view towards eventual kind of larger schemes starting to connect everything up. So I would say that has been hugely helpful. We have also seen other sources of support. So the accelerators, for example, have provided advice as well as some funding. That's been useful, in addition to what can be got nationally, I would say. And then I think, in particular in some of the other schemes, I think there is a real role, I think, for on a softer side, if I may, just to finish, London sets out strong ambitions for decarbonisation in the heat network sector that I do think also set a tone and have been hugely proactive in how they engage, for example, with government and emerging policy, so that where we get to on policy, particularly regulation around zoning, for example, customer regulation, actually works. So there's also the softer side there, I think, in terms of how London can use the weight that it has to make sure that we're going in the right direction.
Thank you. Stephen?
Can I just come in on?
Yeah,
can I come in on top of that? I think it has been incredibly useful in setting that tone. Again, it's been very useful. I think particularly on the developer side. So here, when we're talking about heat networks which have been developed, they, up to date, have been predominantly at a development level. So they've either been within buildings or within a collection of buildings and being put together. I think the London Plan, which has generally been referred to when we look at it from a developer perspective, it's meant that people have gone into these developments with the concept that this is going to be a heat network supplying heat. And that's actually allowed the whole supply chain within London to develop in terms of the people are designing the networks. Everyone's actually becoming familiar with that. They're working together. They're working with the architects to look at actually how do we design these buildings in such a way that it works together. So it's actually really important you start right at the start from a planning stage with that. And then when you're bringing that through in terms of actually delivering it, I think it's just taken away some of the question marks that's allowed them to be a lot more effective in how they've been delivered. And now what this means is we've now got quite a few of these different networks around that we can now start joining the dots, connecting up, which then provides a sort of load that we're going to need when we're starting to bring through that backbone and connecting up to larger schemes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got all of these heat networks in London. The fact that 1 in 10 Londoners is already on a heat network probably is a proof of the pudding, if you like, that they've been effective in terms of driving heat networks. But what's been said, I think, is that it's very patchwork at the moment. So you take an area like Nine Elms, and you've got lots of different heat networks, lots of different communal heat or development level heat networks being built there. Very few of them are actually connected up. And actually, the next stage is about linking them all up into one big district heat network, which gives you the opportunity to decarbonise them and so on, and hopefully lower the cost of the heat in the process. And that, I think, is where the current kind of planning policies have not been able to kind of drive that. That's got to be driven, I think, probably by zoning policy, and zoning gives us the opportunity to strategically plan this. It can't just be left to a higgledy-pig of different developers doing different sites. It has to be strategically planned and delivered as a network across London.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if I were just to build on something that Gareth said, we've talked about planning, particularly on the kind of new development side, on the building side. I think it's also important to consider planning in terms of new developments that might be producing heat. What we've seen, for example, is that when you take data centres as an example, it is so much easier to tap that heat if that is put in right from the very beginning as a planning condition. And indeed, that is why we are seeing some of the connections coming through from data centres now. It's not impossible, but it's harder to retrofit. I had a great conversation with someone actually in Havering who he was a councillor there. He'd had no idea what a heat network was, got taken to Copenhagen, saw the scale of ambition and what we could really achieve by using waste heat in this way, came back and said, right, if there's going to be data centres in my patch, they're going to be required to provide low-cost heating to the local communities around as a condition of their planning. And that's been really important as well. So important to note the heat source too.
Thank you. That was going to be my follow-up. Is this sort of is there a role for the mayor and the assembly to have a sort of an awareness raising piece? It's a tricky one because you can't sort of go out to the public and say hello, here are heat networks. Would you like to be part of one? It doesn't work like that. But at the moment, I would say you could throw bricks around in most of the densest populated parts of London, and most people wouldn't have a clue what heat networks are. So is there that sort of awareness raising task for the Assembly, do you think, in trying to evangelise?
I mean, if I can start, from our perspective, I think we've been talking a lot today around, heat networks and some of the challenges that they face. I think the one thing I would say that's really important, lots of the challenges we are talking about today are the challenges of heat decarbonisation overall, right? In governance, in terms of cost, in terms of how we protect consumers. So when you look, for example, at recent statistics around awareness, heat decarbonisation still enormously trails understanding amongst the public around broader net zero. Things like EVs, for example, are very well understood. They're actually they have more salience publicly now than net zero itself under some statistics. But heat decarbonisation and the contribution of gas boilers to climate change and the changes we're seeing in our climate is much less understood. So firstly, there is an enormous role, I think, in the capital to be spreading awareness about the need to decarbonise heat overall. And then part of that, I think it's really, really important that we are starting to sort of talk about the ways in which we are going to do this in a meaningful way. I think that's got to be different in different areas. So, lots of businesses will connect to heat networks. That's what we see with lots of the big district schemes. And business engagement is going to be hugely important. What we don't want to be doing in a period where we are struggling for economic growth is putting bills up for businesses. So engaging with them in the proper way, but also with householders, particularly those who are already on a heat network. And, lots of people don't realise they're on a heat network. So knowing that regulation is coming, knowing that they now have citizens' advice, the Energy Ombudsman, that they can turn to for advice is really important. And then sort of spreading the word more generally.
Lovely. Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I mean, I would agree that an awful lot of people on heat networks don't know they're on a heat network. You know, they know, and why would you, in a sense? You know, you want hot water when you turn on the tap, and you want your radiators to get hot. How that happens, you know, particularly if you're renting a flat, you know, is something which you may not think about. You probably don't think about, and you know, there's a box on the wall. You don't really know whether it's a gas boiler or a heat interface unit onto a heat network or an electric boiler or whatever it is. And we do, unfortunately, because of the lack of regulation and the lack of processes around mandatorily providing information to consumers, we have seen a lot of examples where you get surprise bills people weren't expecting, people don't know that they're on a heat network, and all of that kind of stuff, which hopefully the regulations that are coming in January will make a big difference in terms of making sure that the practices and the information and the way in which customers are treated is much improved. Won't necessarily lower prices, but it will improve a lot of those other issues which lead to customer detriment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought you were passing over just now. Can I just pick up the point about the London plan and the impact that that's had so far? I can just come back to you, Caroline, and then see if anyone else wants to come in. We're going through a review of the London plan right now. What do you think the next iteration of the London plan should include in relation to heat networks, if anything? Or do you think it's good enough as it is?
So I think one of the big things that we need to look at within the London plan is a recognition of the shift that we talked about a little bit ago, from continuing to support new build connections for heat networks, but a much stronger sense of where things are going on the retrofit side in connection to existing buildings. I think the GLA has started to set out its strategy there, but that's really, really important going forward. And that would be, I think, that alongside how we manage new sources of heat that are coming through, particularly through the planning process, I think would be the two big things we need to see.
Stephen or Gareth, do you want to add anything to that?
I just think that as well as decarbonising heat, there has to be a focus on heat cost for consumers. So, arguably you can decarbonise heating in a block of flats by just installing electric panel heaters throughout. Yes, that's decarbonised, but it's going to be extremely expensive for the consumers.
So earlier on you were saying one of the ways of managing costs is about storage, so that it's not just putting things in, it's also making sure that heat is stored so that it can be
so it's about
generated cheaply and then stored and then used.
Exactly. So it's about building an infrastructure that provides low lifetime costs for the people who are going to live there, not just something, because you can tick the box of decarbonisation by installing something that's extremely expensive for the consumer long term. That's not in it's not in the consumer's interest. Might be in the developer's interest. But I think there has to be a focus on providing affordable heat to consumers long term throughout the life of that development, as well as decarbonisation. I think those two need to go hand in hand.
Okay, so it's not just focusing on putting on the shiny things when the development is being done, but thinking about the cost to the consumer over the potentially 30, 50, 100 years of the life of the building, which, as we know, in London, most of the buildings have been here for quite a few lifetimes. Gareth, did you want to add anything to what you would like to see, any improvements in the London plan?
I think the point that Stephen just made is really important. Yeah. There will be a natural tendency for those developing new build developments to try going to the lowest cost for them CapEx option, which is to put in direct electric. That would have very significant, and we're seeing it would have very significant long-term cost implications. It's also, from a wider perspective, trying to decarbonise that really makes it difficult, and particularly from a grid perspective and the infrastructure we need there makes that very difficult as well. We can't afford that sort of load onto the system. So I think that's the point. The other one I'd like to pick up on is one that Caroline was making before, and it's not just a heat use side, it's also in terms of generation and those who have waste heat or heat available being required to connect into these systems so we can extract away. And again, I've been through a number of them. It is very difficult to get people to connect to, because that's not their day job. They have this heat available, but it's not their core business. If I'm a data centre. My job isn't providing heat. My job is about providing data facilities. So making it integral to what they want to do, to actually tie it into, okay, I'm going to be part of this community here, and I'm going to provide heat back, and sort of incentivising that would be really useful, because that extracting heat out from those systems is going to be part of the core of what we do going forward.
Sure. I mean, I've worked on building energy management systems in a previous life, and it's obviously, the IT team aren't that interested in all the heat generated by the servers in the building, but actually, of course, it can keep the building quite warm and reduce energy costs quite dramatically if you think about how you're using it. However, that's not for today. I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Assembly Member Bassam Mahfouz, who's going to pick up questioning about technical standards.
Right, so I just want to bring it back to the people, the consumers, who we need to bring with us on this. And I was door knocking last week, where some residents who are currently on a heating network are concerned. There is fear about the move to a district heating network, and of course the challenge for lots of people is that they don't have the knowledge about how this operates, and ultimately what they really want is just a reliable heating system. And in today's day and age, with information and misinformation being spread quite quickly about these things, and people being generally sceptical and averse to change, Gareth, you've done a piece of work in terms of making sure that the technical standards are correct for when these are installed. How can you assure Londoners that when these new systems come into play, they also provide reliability?
Yeah, so the new heat network technical assurance scheme that's coming in, first piece is there is going to be a new technical standard released, TS1, which should be coming out shortly. Within, I think the really important thing about the technical assurance scheme coming in is it starts right from day one. So it goes through and it's putting in place in a structured way, ensuring that you've got peer review. So you've got other parties who are not, for example, doing the design, who are impartially reviewing design. So you've got this sort of peer review process, and it's all focused on end performance. So those metrics which are getting used are exactly the sort of thing you're talking about: reliability, efficiency, performance. And that's on an ongoing basis. So what people are being asked to look at during design is, will this design result in that performance in future? If it won't, then they can't then move forward. So there are actually gateways through. There's then going on site, doing inspections of these systems as they're being installed, being assured that they're actually installed to design, and then going through and doing, during commissioning, testing them to making sure they're being set up, making sure that they're resilient. And then on an ongoing basis, people having to, so operators will need to report against these KPIs on an ongoing basis back to a centralised system, and then there will be, where you have performance going outside parameters, then there will be some sort of process of audit and follow-up around that. So we've seen quite a few networks that have come through which have had voluntarily gone through this sort of peer review process. Those perform very well. So I think we've got real examples of networks which perform really well, where the consumers on those networks are happy. They're getting very stable heat, so they're getting good performance. So I think we've got a structure in place that will allow that. What we're now going to do is roll that across all new networks coming through. As Stephen was saying, for existing networks, they'll be staged, it'll be brought in over time. There'll be milestones that people have to hit. Stage one, and then another milestone, and then, but they will have to go through, and all networks will be brought into the same regime eventually.
So it really sounds really positive. It sounds like it's future-proof in terms of a process, and it's clearly around performance and outcome focus. So as new technology comes in, as it always does, you don't need to veer away from this process. You can still apply the same process with the same outcome and performance focus to make sure that it's applied just with the new technology that comes into play. Is that right?
Yeah. To be honest, most of heat network is pretty old tech. We're going back to 1800s for a chunk of this. You're talking about pipes, you're talking about insulation around those pipes, you're talking about transmission valves, those sorts of things. Yes, there is new generation technologies being brought in, but when we think of large-scale heat pumps, for example, we can go and look in Sweden and go back to the 80s, and there were thousands of megawatts of heat pumps installed on heat networks back then. So I think we've got really good technologies. Yes, if there are new technologies, but again, using the same example back into Sweden, they started off quite high carbon, and the example from Denmark that we had previously, a change every 10 years, those generation technologies can change. And yes, we've got a framework in place that will go through, review those, look at how that's being designed, and then take that process through. So, yeah, we feel quite comfortable around that.
Yeah, I think the challenge is in London in particular, because of the success of planning policies and the new homes that have been built and so on over the last decade, is that we've had a lot of heat networks installed before these technical standards are in place. And a lot of those aren't performing very well. And, that's going to be quite a challenge to go back to those developments, some of them not far from here, and, to address really poor performance, and often, the residents that moved into these, have bought flats in them or renting in them, were told they were going to be, the latest high-performing, greatest thing on earth, and that hasn't proved to be the case often in terms of cost for them, and in some cases reliability as well. And so that job of putting right what should have been right from the start is going to be a real challenge. And there's going to be a cost to doing that, and a long, and a series of years to get there. But it's, maybe we should have done this 10 years ago, but it's good that it's happening now. And a huge amount of work's gone into getting it right, and and still it's there's a long way to go, and sadly there's, as I say, there's an awful lot of consumers on heat networks now who aren't getting what they should be getting in terms of efficiency. My concern is that some of those, particularly leaseholders who bought flats, could be faced with some of the remediation costs. And you're almost in a similar sort of situation we've had with building cladding and fire safety, where things have been done badly by developers, and now the homeowners could be faced with the cost of putting it right, already having faced the cost of the system not working as it should be working.
Just so on that point, Stephen, clearly what we want to make sure is that people are not having to have these concerns. Yeah, and I think either yourself or Gareth referred to shelf life of 10 years of systems in Sweden. I think you said, was it?
No, that was more about generation. So we've seen significant changes in generation.
Okay, so the
time.
System didn't need to be changed after 10. Okay, fine. So what's the sort of shelf life of the systems that we're looking to introduce now? When would we be looking to have to change?
What's the shelf life of a water pipe? I mean, there are probably examples that are hundreds of years old, but some pumps and things wear out and need to be replaced. So it depends on which element. I mean, Gareth's more of an expert on the technical side of this than me, but some parts of it should last a very long time indeed. Other parts will need, regular maintenance and inspection and replacement on an ongoing basis. Just as the heating system you have in your home, if you've got a gas boiler, you have to have your gas boiler serviced, but your radiator probably lasts a very long time indeed, and the pipes distributing the water around the radiators probably last a very long time indeed.
Thank you. And I've got Berger online who would like to come in as well.
Yes, considering the when we're talking about the lifetime of the systems, and here I distinguish between what goes on in the building, which is a separate matter. Here we're talking about district heating networks out in the streets. We have our members have just been allowed to increase the depreciation of their networks to 45 years. Years ago, I'm in Copenhagen. We have a large heat transmission system network in Copenhagen. I think it's about 20 years ago, a British consultancy actually assessed the lifetime of the system here in Copenhagen and said at least 75 years. I mean, unless somebody comes along with an excavator and damages the whole thing, they can spend decade after decade in the ground. If you get the right pipes, have them installed by the right people, this can last for many, many decades. That is certainly not an issue.
It's really helpful to know, and incredibly positive in terms of financing, I guess, for these projects. So my final set of questions really in terms of, first of all, start with yourself, Stephen, and then Caroline, is what are the main differences between the different types and generations of heat networks, and how does the choice of these affect the economics of it?
I can start, but I'm not the expert on this really. But I mean, I think, I suppose, we tend to think about the traditional one being a kind of communal boiler, gas boiler in the basement of a building, in a communal heat network, supplying hot water, and the oldest ones, of course, they weren't metered, so you just had a system, a kind of a central heating system for the whole building essentially, and we see quite a lot of examples, particularly in some of the older council estates in London that still operate on this sort of basis. More modern ones, homes have individual connections to the heat network and heat interface unit, a bit like a local boiler, which draws heat off as you need it, and that's a metered supply of heat. And then, of course, we have some examples where you get low-temperature heat networks. So the fluid going around the network is not at 70 degrees, but it might be at 20 degrees or 15 degrees or something like that. And then the local consumer will use a heat pump to elevate that to the temperature they need for their heating and hot water. But in those cases, you can do all sorts of clever things, like if you're running air conditioning or cooling units, you can dump the waste heat back into the network, so you can recycle the heat around. So there are all sorts of options, and then you've got things called shared ground loops, where essentially everyone has their own ground source heat pump, but instead of everyone having their own borehole, you have communal boreholes in the street, and everyone in the street can connect up, and that way you share the capital cost of those boreholes across everyone who's connected to them. It makes it much more cost effective. So I think that the term heat network can cover all sorts of things, but fundamentally it's about distributing heat to consumers. But Gareth is the technical expert.
Can I just come in? So I think probably what you're referring to is first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation heat networks. So this has been referring to a dropping in temperature over time, and there's a framework put together around that. In the UK, there was actually very controversially came up with fifth generation. It's shouldn't have actually come in. Fourth generation actually covers it, so they're actually just termed ultra low temperature heat networks in the sort of international scale, which is what Stephen's referring to there. Effectively, do you need to boost the temperature to use it at the end consumer point or not? And that's where it's ultra low temperature. The fourth generation, fifth generation's a misnomer. There isn't really, you're going from fourth to fifth. They can actually and should exist beside each other. So you can have a fifth generation network where you've got a very low temperature fluid which is being passed, and then it's being boosted, and then you have a fourth generation locally to utilise that. But yeah.
Perhaps the only thing I'll add is just on the economics and how we look at this in terms of cost to consumer. I think, one of the themes of this morning is we are building systems here. And I think you have to think about it like that. So sometimes there's a sense where, heat networks are getting better. Depending on where you're moving on the generation. But actually, it's really about what sources of heat do you have, and then what you're looking at in terms of the buildings that you're looking to connect to. So if you've got sources of high temperature heat, so a really good example in London is the energy from waste plants that we have here. They are relatively high temperature, which is really nice heat. It means you don't have to boost it that much. What you might see on the other side, for example, is buildings where the cost of energy efficiency that you would need in order to have relatively low temperatures in that building to get the comfort that you want is quite expensive. And so what you want is the optimal balance of the types of sources of heat that you have, how you can access them, how far away they are, what the cost is, and the cost of retrofitting that building so that you get the comfort that you need. What we see is particularly, we talked about it in terms of some of the larger schemes. Electricity is expensive in this country. We have one of the highest electricity prices, particularly on the commercial side, of anywhere in Europe. And so what you want to do is use as much of the kind of waste heat or ambient heat in our groundwater, sewers, for example, as you possibly can, so that you don't have to boost it using electricity that much. And you can kind of keep electricity as a kind of precious, quite expensive commodity. So it's a real trade-off, but we're talking about a system overall and which is the best system for the type of area you're decarbonising.
It's all really helpful. Just one question, actually, because, Stephen, you referred to the heat offtake off air conditioning units, and obviously with global warming, more people are now looking to install air conditioning. Can this district heating network be used to cool as well as to heat?
Yes, I mean, we do see heat networks that provide cooling as well as heating, particularly if you've got an ambient temperature network. You can dump heat into it as well as taking heat out. And so, yeah, absolutely. And, we often talk about London having a heat problem, really, too much heat in the summer. And lots of air conditioning unit, but just, lots of concrete storing heat. One of the challenges, I guess, for how we heat our city in the winters is, can we store some of that excess heat that we have and help cool the city down in the summer by storing that heat, take it away, locking it away somewhere so we can use it in the winter.
And on that, when we're thinking about providing cooling, we're not actually providing cooling. What we're doing is extracting heat out of the building. So that's what we're doing. So the more that we can capture that heat and then reutilise it, the better. And that's exactly what's happening with data centres, supermarkets, anything like that, where we can extract that heat and reuse it. And it can be done at low temperatures. It can be done. You can have a parallel cooling system and heating system. We're bringing that heat back to a central place and then reutilising it there. Yeah, there are different ways of doing that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask Birger about the main practical challenges in constructing heat networks, because I suspect you're in a better position than any of us to know about that, because obviously that's something, as you were saying, that Denmark has done over the last 40 years. And what would you say are the main practical lessons to learn from constructing networks?
Some of the practical challenges are they were mentioned earlier. Construction work in streets and roads that are full of traffic and so on is a nuisance to everybody. We are building extending district heating networks and building new networks in suburban areas. The issue is the same, taking up space in the road for construction work and so on. I would say, in context of London, I would mention one problem that is current in Copenhagen and probably also will be in London. Location of production facilities. Copenhagen wants to invest a lot in large-scale heat pumps and electrical boilers, for instance, based on seawater and so on, and store the heat in large heat storage tanks. Where do you find room for that in a city where land is very expensive? Earlier, it was mentioned some of the storage, seasonal storages even. It's difficult in a place like Copenhagen and probably even more so in London. Where do you find land cheap enough to build such installations? We have, Denmark is a world leader in solar thermal district heating. The reason for that is we have district heating out where land is cheap, so we can put up these large fields of solar collectors and seasonal storages. But you're probably not going out there soon. So where do you put that up in Copenhagen? That's a big practical problem in building these networks. And then making sure that you have, I think it was mentioned earlier, that making sure that the networks that you're developing are adequate in terms of the buildings that you're connecting to it. Make sure that you don't build a network with an excessive capacity in relation to what the consumption in the buildings that you're going to connect might have in the future if you improve that buildings as well. The idea would be to improve the building and their supply at the same time, so we do not overbuild a district heating network or under improve your buildings. That is a challenge. That is one of the reasons we have been talking a lot of synchronizing heat planning and or zoning, as you called it, and sort of refurbishment, energy refurbishment of buildings. But how to achieve that, it's all costly and complex. It's difficult, but that would be an important consideration. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful, and it kind of brings me on to my next question, which is which I want to put to. I'll start with Caroline. Is there sufficient funding from the government and the GLA to help establish the heat networks, as well as that overall planning and control that we were talking about earlier?
So what we've seen over the last 5 years, 10 years actually, at a national level has been relatively significant support, not compared to other infrastructure, I would say, hydrogen being the glaring example. But we have seen support from national government, most notably with respect to something called HNIP, and then most latterly the Green Heat Network Fund. What we are hoping to have confirmed in the budget is ongoing capital support for heat networks through the Green Heat Network Fund, and a more ambitious programme through the National Wealth Fund to support heat networks. Heat networks have been a strategic priority of the National Wealth Fund, and then before that its predecessor, the UK Infrastructure Bank, for some time, but they are yet to take a really substantive role in moving forward here. The final thing to say on this, so the Green Heat Network Fund has been important. We are, though, still in a situation where it is extremely difficult for new low-carbon infrastructure to compete with existing high-carbon infrastructure. That is the case across the board for heat decarbonisation. And if the government is not prepared or politically can't look at a gas boiler phase-out, there is going to need to be further funding to close that gap instead.
And does the certainty of some government funding coming in help leverage in additional private finance?
Yes, I think it's been a real mix. I mean, as we've seen, over the last, particularly over the last 5 years, you have seen a shift in the types of financing that has been attracted to the UK market. So, if you went back, say, 5-10 years or so, it was a lot of suppliers, for example, so household names, people like E.ON, for example, who were investing in this market as well as others. The difference over the last 5 years has been we've seen more private equity attracted into this market. Obviously, as we've talked about, you can have big political discussions about what the right role of ownership and governance is in this country. But as it stands, we are not prepared to fund low carbon infrastructure on a municipality or on a government public-backed basis.
No,
for the most part.
I was very struck by what Birger was saying about the very high level of cooperative ownership of heat networks in Denmark, but then also mentioning that Germany and I think Sweden also have got private ownership of heat networks. So it seems to be pretty much ownership blind, if you like, that they have been
100%, exactly.
both publicly owned, but also third sector, if you like, cooperatives, but then also privately.
Yeah, and you see the same thing in the UK, indeed. So when you look, for example, there's a really great heat network called Leeds Pipes, which is being developed between Leeds Council and Vital, as well as others. And actually joint ventures between local authorities and the private sector is a model that's been used quite consistently across the UK for the last 5 to 10 years, I would say. So we see a mix of ownership here too, and through zoning we are likely to see the same, I think. There'll be a greater role for private finance simply because the networks that we're building are larger, but the role of joint ventures and local authority ownership is going to continue.
Thank you. I think that's really useful. Although, unfortunately, as you now mentioned Leeds pipes as being something that perhaps we should look at, I was rather hoping to persuade Committee and Scrutiny Services to allow us to take a trip to Denmark to go and look at the extensive networks there. I somehow feel that they might think that Leeds is a better option. I'd like to thank all of our guests, and especially Birger for joining us online, but they've been really illuminating answers from Gareth, Stephen, Caroline, as well as Birger. We've now reached the end of our questions with yourselves. We've got a few remaining items of business. If you could just stay, it won't take very long at all. And could I just ask the committee to note the report that we received in advance of the discussion and the discussion itself? Is that noted? Thank you. Could I ask you to delegate authority to me in conjunction with party group lead members to agree any outputs arising from today's discussion? Thank you. Moving on to item 6, our Environment Committee work programme. Could I ask you to note our work programme for the remainder of the 25-26 Assembly year? Thank you. And the final item on our agenda really is the date of the next meeting, which is going to be in the afternoon of the 3rd of December in committee rooms 2 and 3. So we're being thrown out of our own chamber for some reason or another. The final item is any other business which I consider to be urgent, but there is none. So I declare this meeting closed.
Home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.